Sword Art Online. Progressive. Interlude. The reason for the whiskers. Urbis, the main city of the second floor of Einkrad, was carved directly into the flat top of 300-yard wide mountain, with only the outer perimeter left standing. Once I was through the southern gate, a notification reading Safe Haven appeared, and the sound of a slow-paced town BGM hit my ears. Unlike the strings, heavy music from the first floor towns, this was played by a wistful oboe. The style of clothes worn by NPC milling about was subtly different, reinforcing the sense of having come to a new floor. About 10 yards past the gate, I took a look around me and didn't find a single green player cursor, as it should be. I just defeated Ilfing, the Kobold Lord's boss of the first floor, barely 40 minutes before. All the other raid party members who had taken part in the fighting had turned back to the first floor, rather than follow the spiral staircase up to the second, which meant there was only one solitary player in this entire vast floor. Kirito, the former beta tester, beat her. It was a luxurious feeling, but it would not last for long. 2 hours after the death of the first floor boss, the teleport gate in the center of the town's main floor, Urbis in this case, would automatically activate, linking up the gate and the floor below. As soon as that happened, the entire flood of exiting players would burst through the portal. On the flip side, that meant that if I felt like it, I could monopolize this floor for another hour and 20 minutes. With that much time, I could complete 2 or 3 slaughter quests to kill a certain number of monsters without having to jostle with other players. It was a tempting idea for a truly self-interested solo adventurer, but I didn't have the guts to hold out on hundreds, if not thousands of players below who were waiting for the gate with bated breath. I trotted through the main street of Urbis, directly north, climbing a wide staircase to the open town center, which featured a large gate in the middle. It was not really a gate so much as a standing stone arch, with no door or fence connected to it. The only space beneath the arch was gently rippling somehow. It was like a very thin, very vertical film of water suspended in the air. Only after scanning the perimeter for a convenient escape route did I reach out the shifting, transparent veil. My fingertip, converged by a black leather, brushed the water surface. The light pulsed outward in concentric circles until it filled the 15-foot arch. Once the entire space was full, the teleport was complete, and the town had been opened. The exact same phenomenon was happening at the same time down at the first floor. The players below would be preparing to dash through the finished portal now that they realized they wouldn't need to wait a full 2 hours. But I didn't wait to witness the entire show. I turned and sped toward a church-like building on the east end of the square, bursting through the door and scrambling up the stairs inside. Eventually, I made my way into a small room on the 3rd floor, and set my back up against the wall next to a window, so I could see down into the clearing. At that precise moment, the interior gate flashed, and the NPC musicians set up in a corner of the square and began to play the bright, cheery opening fanfare. A second later, countless players spilled out of the blue light in a jumble of colors. Some stopped in the middle of the clearing and looked around. Some held parchment maps bought from information dealers and took off running. Some jammed fists into the air and shouted, "We made it to the 2nd floor!" A similar town opening had occurred 9 times into SAO, beta test, and in each case, the raid members who had dispatched the previous floor's boss lined up facing the new teleport gate, sulking in applause and congratulations of those traveled upward to see the new environment. But in this case, I was the only person who had stuck around to open the town, and I'd taken off running. There would be no grand celebratory event. Perhaps those looking curiously around the square were searching for me, but I could not step forward to name myself. Just minutes earlier, after we defeated the boss, I made a proclamation to the 40-some raid members that I, Kirito, was not just some beta tester, but a beater, who had ascended further than any of the 1,000 testers, accumulating more information about the game than anyone else. It wasn't out of desire to play the villain. I did it to avoid having the wrath of a new retail players focused on the former testers. But the end result was that, soon, every high-level player in the game would know of my infamy. Appearing in public would not provoke cheers but ugly booing. I didn't have the willpower to withstand that kind of open hostility. So I decided to hide out on the third floor of this chapel until the excitement in the town square subsided. However, I noticed something odd down on the square. One female player who traveled through the gate ran a pell-mell straight to the west end of the square. She might have been rushing to find a weapon shop or quest-giving NPC, but the real issue were the two men who showed up after her. They stopped briefly, looked around for the retreating player, and then raced after her. They were clearly chasing the woman. The safe haven of town was under an anti-crime code, so normally I'd pay no attention to something like that. But it was different when the person being chased was someone I knew. Those brown curls and plain leather armor belonged to none other than Argo the Rat. Plenty of people hated her for her motto of selling information with a price. But something was wrong if they were hurtling around at that speed. I pondered the situation for a moment, then put a foot on the windowsill and leapt down to the short roof below. I dashed across the tiles and leapt on to the next roof, making good use of my high agility stat before anyone could spot me, and continued along the rooftop in the direction of the chase. This feat was only possible thanks to the uniform height of the buildings in Urbis. I waved my hand to call up my menu as I ran after them, clicking the search button with my skills tab. When a sub-menu followed, I selected Pursuit, then entered the name, Argo, into the field. A set of green footsteps suddenly glowed on the path below me. Pursuit was a modifier effect of the search skill once it proficiently leveled high enough. It was designed to increase the efficiency of monster hunting, but it could also be used to track a player on your friends list. My level was still fairly low, so I could only see footsteps up to a minute old. I raced alongside the trail, trying to keep up before they vanished. If Argo, with her incredible agility, couldn't shake the two men, they were bad news. I couldn't recognize them from the boss raid, but they had to be among the top players by level. Moreover, the chase proceeding straight down westward route and through the town carved into the outer perimeter of the flat-topped mountain in which Urbis was nested. The plains of the west town were dangerously zone-populated with castle monsters. The situation was looking downright grim now. I bit my lip and raced onto the virtual savanna. The wasteland beyond the plains was deadly, enough that even at my level it was too risky to go in there alone. Fortunately, the footsteps in the grass were growing brighter, meaning that Argo's pace was slowing and getting closer. Eventually, I reached a small canyon between the two rocky hills and heard a familiar voice. "Told you 100 times! I wouldn't sell the info no matter the price!" The nasal inflection was undoubtedly Argo, but it was fiercer in anger than I'd ever heard before. Next was a similarly furious man's voice. "You do not intend to monopolize the information, but neither will you reveal it. One can only assume that you seek to inflate the value in order to sell." His way of speaking was oddly archaic. I slowed down and began to climb the rock face at the side of the canyon. Even the most forbidding terrain in SAO could be climbed with enough persistence and cleverness. It was a secret ambition of mine to one day attempt to scale the enormous pillars that separated the floors of Aincrad in hopes of bypassing the labyrinths altogether. But my clandestine climb in this case was not done for want of good challenge, but to guarantee my own safety. After about 15 feet, I reached a narrow flat space that overlooked the canyon. I crawled forward onto my hands and knees. The shouting voices were almost directly below me. It's not a matter of price. I'm saying that I don't want to sell something that gets me all hatred in return. The second man responded, What quarrel would we have with you? As we said, we will pay the asking price and be grateful for your service. Just sell us the information of this floor's special quest that grants the extra skill. What? Now I held my breath entirely. Extra skills were hidden abilities that cannot be chosen without meeting the special conditions. Only one had been discovered in the beta, the meditation skill, in which assuming a pose of concentration increased the HP recovery rate and decreased the infliction time of negative status effects. Because of its tricky usage and very uncool look, a few bothered to earn it. I had suspicions that the katana skill used by the Kobold Lord in the samurai monsters on the 10th floor be an extra skill as well, but the means to unlock it were still a mystery. At any rate, Argo and the two wannabe actors were clearly not talking about meditation. The NPC who taught that skill was up at the 6th floor. No, this was about some hidden quest on the 2nd floor that I didn't even know about, and neither did almost any of the other Forma testers. That unlocked an extra skill, and two strange men were pressing Argo for that information. The men's voice grew louder. We're not backing down. Not today, you see. That extra skill is necessary for us to complete our characters, you see. You just don't get it. I'm not going to sell to anyone. You see? I'm not going to sell it. Period. The tension in the air turned electric, crackling tangibly. I leapt to my feet on the rocky ledge and jumped down to the 15 feet to the ground floor, landing perfectly between Argo and the men. I didn't quite have enough agility points to jump that distance without damage, so I had to tense my knees to cushion the shock. Who goes there? Interloper from an enemy province. A single glance at their outfits sent a powerful shock through my memory. They wore a full-body cloth armor in dark gray, with light chainmail on top. I noticed a small scimitar draped over their backs, a dark gray bandana cap, and a pirate mask to match the armor. Taken as a whole, these outfits could be interpreted as a creative attempt to recreate the classic ninja costume. I couldn't help but feel as though I'd seen people dressed in this style during the beta as well. Oh, let me see, food, no, figure, no, not that either. It's Fuma. We are Kotaro and Isuke from the Fuma Ninja Force. Right, that was it. I snapped my fingers, satisfied that my memory had been corrected. These two members of the Ninja Guild feared for their incredible speed during their beta test. As to why that they would be feared, like Argo, raised their agility as a high possible, forming as a wall of an eye popping speed in the front line, then running off when the battle grew too dangerous. When the monsters followed in pursuit, they usually wound up targeting a different party with the ninjas escaped, which earned them a very bad reputation indeed. I didn't realize that they'd continued their adherence to the way of a shinobi even after SAO had become a game of death. But I didn't have any issue with their choice. For now. But chasing down a female player and ganging up on her and demanding her trade secrets was crossing a line. I reached to the back to make sure Argo was safely behind me, and ran a finger along the hilt of my anneal blade +6. As a spy for the Shogun, I cannot overlook the wicked deeds of the Fuma. Instantly, Kotaro and Isuke's eyes flashed beneath their hoods, off ninja hoods. You eager dog! Huh? It seemed my half-assed joke had struck a nerve. They'd been confused me for a member of a rival school. In perfect rhythm, they reached over their shoulders to remove scimitars that passed for ninja blades. They weren't going to draw on me, were they? Then again, we were out in the open, where the anti-crime code had no effect. If a player had attacked another player, damage would be done. At the same time, the aggressor's cursor would turn orange, signifying them as a criminal and keeping them from entering towns. Even ninjas could not fool the god that presided over this game. I briefly considered resolving the argument with the preposterous claim that I wasn't an Iga ninja, but a Koga ninja like them, when the situation was resolved in the most unexpected way. When I snuck into the canyon, I scaled the walls in order to eavesdrop on their conversation, rather than standing around near the entrance. I did this because we were out in the wild wilderness, not in town, and standing around in a place for long enough always led to one thing happening. I took a careful step backward and murmured, "Behind you." "We will not fall for your trickery." "It's not trickery, look behind you." Something in my voice convinced the skeptical ninjas. Kotaro and Isuke turned their heads and abruptly leapt backwards. Right before their eyes, someone had joined the group. No, something. It was a trembling ox, a giant cattle monster unique to the second floor, standing over 8 feet at the shoulder. Its attack power and toughness were obvious at a glance. But what they made them so dangerous was their extremely long targeting range, both in time and distance. I'd climb the inaccessible boulders specifically to avoid drawing notices of these fearsome beasts. "Roar!" the ox roared. "Gah!" the ninjas screamed in unison. With a stunning speed, 2 gray-clad birds shot back toward the town away from the canyon. But the ox showed a surprising agility for its size. In no more than 5 seconds, the rumbling footsteps and screams disappeared over the horizon. Kotaro and Isuke would likely be in a foot race all the way back to Urbis. The great ninja war averted for now. I sighed in relief and looked down at my body. Until an hour ago, I'd been wearing a boring outfit of black leather pants, cotton shirt, and a dark gray leather coat. However, with the unique Coat of Midnight I had looted from the ill-famed Kobold Lord, I was dressed in full black to match my hair and eyes. It seemed like a good way to reinforce the dirty beater persona I'd developed. But I had to admit, it also made me look a bit like a ninja. I started to wonder if I should put on a different color undershirt just to avoid any rumors about Kirito, the Iga ninja, from now on. Once again, I was broken out of my thoughts by a very unexpected event. 2 small arms reached out and squeezed around my midsection from behind. I felt a soft warmth on my back and heard a faint whisper. "That was a little too much showing off, keyboy." Belonged to Argo, who had been silent since I leapt from my perch. But it felt as though the sound of her voice was different somehow from the snide, obnoxious rat I knew. "Keep that up, and you might force Big Sister to break a very first rule of the information dealer." Big Sister? The first rule of the information dealer? They were very intellectually curious words, but as the middle school game addict with zero personality skill, I had no idea how to react to this situation. I froze up, my mind racing, and eventually found my answer. "You owe me one, remember? I can't have anything happen to you until you explain the reason for your whiskers." Argo the rat had 3 thick black whisker lines drawn on either cheek with face paint. They were the source of her nickname, but no one knew why she painted them in the first place. She claimed the answer would cost an astonishing price of 100,000 coal, but in the recent boss battle, I had taken on the mantle of beater, distinguishing myself from the majority of beta testers, including Argo, and drawing the ire of new retail players away from them. After that, she sent me a message of thanks, offering a single piece of information for free. I told her I'd want to know the reason for her whiskers. I'd meant to be a light-hearted joke, to ease the gravity of the situation, but that only made Argo press her face harder into my back. "Okay, I'll tell you. Just wait so I can get the paint off." "Huh? The paint? Meaning her whiskers?" Oh, so she was going to show me her plain face. something she'd never shown anyone in the game. Was this meant to be a symbolic act with a deeper meaning? My social anxiety rose to a dangerous peak. Before she could let go, I shouted, "Never mind. I've got a better idea. How about you tell me the details of that hidden skill those guys were on about?" When Argo let go and came to my front, she fortunately still had 3 big whiskers on either cheek. I could have sworn that just before she'd let go, she'd muttered a faint "coward." Or was that just my imagination? Back to her usual impertinent glare, the rat crossed her arms and grunted. "Well," I said, I tell you any one thing, and that's a deal. But you need to promise me something as well, Key Boy. You can't blame me for what happens, no matter what. You said the same thing to those ninjas earlier. What do you mean by that? Why would someone bear a grudge against you for selling information of an extra skill that everyone wants? Argo answered my question with her familiar wry grin. "That'll one will cost you, Key Boy." As I stifled a sigh, "All right, I promise. Swear to God. I swear to the system. No matter what happens, I won't hold it against you. Even if this quest for an extra skill was potentially deadly, I could determine that on my own." Argo nodded and beckoned to me to follow. The route we traveled from there would never have occurred to me without a map or an item, or an infinite curiosity and persistence. She took me up to the side of one of the many flat-topped mountains that dotted the second floor, which was the same size of the first, then into a small cave, and then down the underground river like a water slide. We ran into 3 battles along the way, but with my careful leveling and preparation for the first floor boss, they were no big deal. The trip took about 30 minutes, all told. Based on our map location, it seemed we had nearly scaled the rocky mountain that loomed over the eastern edge of the second floor. We were in a small clearing surrounded by sheer rock walls all around, with nothing else but a spring of water, a single tree, and a tiny shed. "Is this it?" Argo nodded. I strode up to the building. It seemed there was no danger, at least so far. Suddenly, the door before me flew open. Inside, there were a few pieces of furniture and one NPC. It was a large, elderly man, all muscle and bone, bald and cue ball with a magnificent beard. There was a golden exclamation mark above his head, the sign of a quest. I looked back at Argo and she nodded. "That's the NPC who gives you the extra skill, martial arts. This is all I can tell you. It's up to you whether you can accept this quest or not." Martial arts? I'd never heard him the term in the beta. Argo offered a few extra tidbits, claiming that they were on the house. "Martial arts is a catch-all term for attacks using just hands and no weapons. I expect. It'll be useful when you drop a weapon or it runs out of durability and breaks." Whoa, yeah, that actually seems useful, unlike meditation in that case. I guess I can see why those ninjas were so set on getting it for themselves. Argo looked quizzically, so I shot back an explanation of my own. "On the house. People think ninjas use ninja blade and shurikens, but it's a bit different in the gaming world. One good wrist chop at the neck and the head flies off. For whatever reason, that's been the pinnacle of any video game ninja style. So, Kotaro and Isuke wanted the martial arts skill to round out their perfect image of a ninja. But in that case, if they didn't know where to find this place, then how did they know to get involved with the skill? And that you knew this one about it too. This one doubles on the house. At the very end on the beta, the NPC on the 7th floor revealed some info about the martial arts master down at the 2nd floor. I'd found him long before that, of course, but I'm guessing the ninjas heard it from a fellow on the 7th floor. So, once I started getting all into the strategy guide business here, they came to me for the details on the extra skill. Then why didn't you just say you didn't know? They wouldn't be harassing you so much. She grimaced at the straightforward question. I think my pride as an information merchant prevented me from simply saying, I don't know. So you said you did, but you wouldn't sell it. Well, I guess I can see why you would make that statement. I stifled a sigh and looked back at the NPC, who had assumed a zen position on a single tatami-like mat at the center of the shack. And you didn't sell the information because you were afraid your buyer would blame you for it. Well, if you ask me, it seems like you've made more than a few enemies already. Any grudge over the information sold or bought only lasts 3 days. But this one's different. It could last a lifetime. Argo's petite body shivered. I pondered for several seconds, and then came to a conclusion. So, I guess I have to find out what happened after this point for myself. Alright, you've got a deal. Whatever happens, happens. I won't hold it against you. I stepped into the shack and stood in front of the meditating man. He was wearing a tattered outfit and what looked like a robe. You want to follow my school? That's right. The road of training is long and fraught with peril. That is what I like to hear. The exclamation mark over his head turned into a question mark, and the quest exception log scrolled over my eyes. My new master escorted me on the back of the shack to a massive boulder at the edge of his stone-lined garden. He walked over and patted the stone, a good 6 feet tall and 5 across. Then rubbed his whiskers with the other hand. Your training is simple. Split this stone with your 2 fists. If you succeed, I will teach you all of my secrets. Timeout. Startled by this unexpected challenge, I gave the large rock a light tap. Once you got used to the game, you could tell the durability of a target based on the physical sensation. What I felt was an ultra hard surface, just one notch below immortal object. Yep, can't do this. I turned back to the teacher, ready to cancel the quest, but before I could speak, you are not permitted to descend this mountain until you break the stone. I will put the sign upon you now, the teacher said, pulling out 2 objects from his robe pockets. In his left hand was a small jar, in the right, a thick, magnificent paintbrush. Suddenly, I had such a bad feeling about this, and that their words of a bad feeling practically popped into existence over my head. Before I could announce that I was quitting the School of Martial Arts, the master hand shot out with a terrific speed. He plunged the tip of the paintbrush into the pot and whipped it across my face. It was that precise moment that I understood where Argo's whiskers came from. She had found this old man on her own during the beta and accepted his quest. Who wouldn't? He ordered her to break the stone and drew on her face 3 whiskers on either cheek. What? I shrieked pitifully and fell back. My glance met Argo's, her ratty face full of deep sadness and empathy, and the tension of one holding back the biggest gut laugh she'd ever had. Freed from the brush attack, I tried to rub it off my face with my hands, but the ink was ultra quick drying, and none of it came off my fingers. The master nodded in satisfaction at his work, and then delivered a shocking but sadly predictable proclamation. That sign will not vanish until you break this rock and complete your training. I have faith in your potential, my apprentice. And he plodded back to his shed through the door. After a good 10 seconds of standing in place, I looked at Argo, whose face was still a subtle mixture of emotions. I see. So you took this quest during the beta and had to give up. You played until the very end of the beta with those whiskers still drawn on your face. Ultimately, that helped you to develop the persona of the rat. So you kept the tradition of the paint when the retail game shipped. It all makes sense. Brilliant deduction, she applauded. Aren't you lucky, Keyboy? You got both the reason for my whiskers and the details of the extra skill. Package in one. In fact, I'll let you know into one more nugget. That rock is hard as hell. Figures. I resisted the urge to fall onto the ground and ask if one last question of my final hope. Hey, did he paint the whiskers on my face just like yours? They're not the same. Oh, what are they like? If they weren't too obvious or looked kind of cool, I'd have the option of going back to my regular life with a slightly different look. I didn't have the guts to go look into my reflection in the pond, so I let Argo stare for another 3 seconds. If I had to describe them in one word, it would be Kirimon. That was the last straw for her. She fell into the ground, flailing her feet back and forth and screeching with laughter. Over and over. After 3 solid days on the mountain and countless painful attempts, I broke that rock. And I'm just glad I didn't have to hate Argo for the rest of my life. Sword Art Online. Progressive. Rondo for a Fragile Blade. Second floor of Einkrad. December 2022. 1. Screw you! My feet stopped when a high-pitched shriek hit my ears. I took a few quick steps aside and pressed my back up against the wall of the NPC's shop. Up ahead, the path opened into a wider plaza, from which the disturbance was coming. Put it back! Put it back the way it was! That was a +4! Put it back the way it was! Another shriek. It sounded like an argument between two players. Given that we were in the protected zone of Urbis, the main city of the second floor of Einkrad, the disagreement was unlikely to lead to physical harm to either player. I certainly had no reason to hide, given that it had no direct harm to me. But, even though I understood that well enough, I couldn't help but be more cautious than usual these days. After all, Kirito, the level 13 swordsman, was the most hated solo player in Einkrad. The first man to be known as a beater. Thursday, December 8th, 2022, was the 32nd day of Sword Art Online, the Game of Death. Ilfang, the Kobold Lord, master of the first floor, was dead. 4 days had passed since the teleporter gate of Urbis went active. In those 4 days, the story of what happened to the boss chamber had spread among the game's top players, albeit with wings on its own. A boss monster with the katana skill, a piece of information that wasn't previously known. The death of Diovel the Knight, leader of the raid, and one beater, a beta tester who got further than anyone and used his knowledge to steal the last hit on the boss and reap the rewards. Fortunately for me, while the name Kirito had spread like wildfire, only 40 or so players had actually knowledge of my physical appearance within the game. And in SAO, the names of strangers did not appear in the in-game cursors. That was only reason I could walk through the town without fear of being pelted by stones. Then again, even if that did happen, a purple system wall would deflect the projectiles. Even still, I felt ashamed that I was removing my signature coat of midnight, my prize for defeating the boss, and wearing a wide bandana to escape notice. It wasn't that I was so desperate for human contact that I would sneak into city in disguise. I just needed to refill on potions and rations, as well as perform maintenance on my equipment. There was a small shop at the edge of the village of Maroon, about 2 miles southeast of Urbis. But its selection was poor, and there were no NPC blacksmiths I could repair my weapon. Due to these factors, I was busy in the market on the south side of Urbis, filling my item storage with sundry goods and supplies, then making my way alongside the street toward my next errand, where I heard the shouts. Out of reflex, I had to check to make sure the angry screams weren't directed at me first, then sighed in disappointment at my own timidity. Satisfied that it wasn't me, I resumed my trip to the Eastern Plaza, which was both my destination and the source of the argument. In less than a minute, I had arrived at a circular, bowl-like open space. It was relatively crowded for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which was normally prime adventuring time. Most likely foot traffic was due to recent opening of the town. There were plenty of players coming up from the town of beginnings on the first floor to visit the new city. The flow of pedestrians slowed down in the corner of the plaza, and I could hear the same shouts coming from that area. I had slipped through the crowd and crammed my neck trying to detect the source of the argument. What did you do? The properties were all way down. I vaguely recognized the red-faced man. He was a proper frontier player, not a tourist. He hadn't taken part in the first floor boss raid, but his full suit of metal armor and large three-horned helmet spoke to his level. What truly drew my eye, however, was the naked longsword clutched in three-horned man's right hand. The edge couldn't hurt anyone inside town, but the idea that he would wave it around in the midst of a crowd was distasteful. He was too furious to think straight. However, he stuck the tip into the pavement stone and continued bellowing. How could you possibly fail 4 times in a row? You can't have reduced my sword to +0. I should have left it with the damn NPC. You owe me for this, you third-rate blacksmith. Standing quietly in a plain brown leather apron and looking guilty through the minutes of raging insults was a short, male player. He'd set up a gray carpet at the edge of the plaza, with a chair, anvil, and self crowded together. The rug was a vendor's carpet, an expensive item that allowed a player to set up a simple shop in the middle of town, unnecessary for any enterprising merchant or crafter. You could display your wares without a carpet, of course, but when left abandoned in the open like that, the items would lose durability bit by bit as time wore on, and there were no defense against thievery. In the beta tests, I'd seen a lively player markets along the main streets of all major cities with carpets of every color, but this was the very first I'd noticed since SAO's retail release had turned deadly. In fact, it was the very first non-NPC blacksmith I'd seen. Now that I recognized the circumstances, the reason for the uproar was clear. The man, repeatedly slamming his sword into the ground, had paid the silent, drooping blacksmith to the 40th blade. In general terms, a player of the same level would be better at augmenting weapons than an NPC. The requisite production skill had to be a certain level, of course, but that could generally be recognized at a glance. The crafting tools used in this case, the blacksmith's hammer, were all grouped into their tiers that could be equipped with the right level of skill proficiency. The iron hammer, resting on the silent blacksmith's anvil, required a higher level than a bronze hammer this town's NPCs used. So this blacksmith should have better odds at strengthening weapons than NPCs of Urbis. In fact, he couldn't run a business without them, which was why the three-horned man had entrusted him with his beloved sword. Unfortunately, however, the weapon augmentation in SAO was not a surefire success unless one's skill proficiency was quite high. With a failure rate of 30%, there was a 9% chance of failing twice in a row, and a 3% chance of 3 failures. Even the tragic outcome of 4 consecutive failed attempts had a 0.8 chance of occurring. The terrifying thing was that in a vast online RPG world, these odds were just high enough to happen every now and then. I played games before where this feature on rare items with drop rates were like 0.01% that made you want to scream, "You're joking!" And plenty of lucky players would wind up with them. I played that such cruelly rare items did not exist in SAO, but a part of me knew that they must, and that I would spend days and days in the dungeon looking for them. "What's all the ruckus about?" someone muttered in my ear, startling me out of my thoughts. It was a slender fencer. She wore a white leather tunic, pale green leather tights, and a silver breastplate. Her facial features were so pristine and graceful that you might wonder how an elf wandered into the world of Aincrad. But the crude, gray wool of her cape from her head to her waist ruined that effect. But she didn't have much of a choice. If she'd taken off that cape and let her luscious brown hair and elven beauty catch the sun, she'd never escape the attention of the crowds again. I took a deep breath to calm my head and respond to this person I might actually call a friend. One of the very first I had in this world. Well, the guy with the horned helmet wanted the other one to power up his. At this point, I realized that I, like her, was in disguise. I didn't want to believe that my nondescript costume of plain leather armor and a yellow and blue striped bandana was that easy to see through. Perhaps I ought to pretend that I did not know her. Oh, well, have we met before? The look I got in response was like a twin rapier thrust, burning holes through the center of my face. Met? Why, I believe we've shared meals and been in a party together. Oh, I remember, of course. I believe I lent you to use my bath. Thunk! The sharp heel of her hornet boot slammed down on the top of my right foot. A piece of my memory disintegrated. I cleared my throat, pinched the edge of the hood, and walked over a few yards away from the crowd so we could have a proper conversation. Hi, Asuna. Long time no see. If 2 days counts. Good afternoon, Mr. Kirito. 2 days ago, when I'd met her on the front line, I claimed that there was no need for formality between avatars. But as this was her first VR game, she seemed to have difficulty getting over that. And when I'd offered to call her Miss Asuna in return, she said it was a pain in the neck and totally unnecessary. I didn't understand women. At any rate, once the pleasantries had been peacefully exchanged, I turned back to unpleasantries with the blacksmith and gave her a brief explanation. It seems the guy in the three-horned helmet asked the blacksmith to strengthen his weapon, but the process failed 4 times in a row, returning it back to a +0 state, so he's furious about it, which I can understand. I mean, 4 in a row. Asuna the Fencer, the fastest and most cool-headed player I knew in Aincrad. I'd also add, most beautiful, but I didn't want to cross the line of my personal harassment code, shrugged her shoulders and said, the one who asked the other had to be aware of the possibility of failure. And doesn't the blacksmith have the rates of success for different weapons posted? Plus, it says that if he fails, he'll only charge the cost of the upgrade materials and not the labor. Really? That's quite considerate, I muttered, recalling the image of the short blacksmith, bowing and scraping repeatedly. 40% of my sympathy had been for the three-horned man, whose weapon had been ruined, but now it dropped to close to 20. I'm guessing that after that first failure, the blood rushed to his head, so he kept demanding another attempt to make it up. Losing your self-control and paying a terrible price for it is a constant feature for any form of gambling. That almost sounded like it had a personal experience behind it. No, just a common sense observation. I avoided looking at her, sensing that telling her I'd lost all my money at the 7th floor Monster Coliseum during the beta test was not going to win me any points. Asuna gave me a piercing look for several seconds before mercifully returning to the topic at hand. Well, I can say I don't feel sorry for him, but that kind of rage doesn't seem necessary. He can just save up the money for another attempt. Well, it's not that simple. Oh, what do you mean? She asked. I jabbed a thumb at the anneal blade +6 strapped over my back. The three-horned guide's sword is an anneal blade, just like mine. He must have gone through that terrible quest on the first floor to get it too. On top of that, he'd gone to the trouble of having an NPC bump it up to +5. The odds really start to drop. That's why he had a player blacksmith try it. But the first attempt failed, so now it's back to +3. He asked for another attempt, hoping to get back to where he started, but it fails again, down to +2. Then process repeats. The third and fourth attempts fail, so now he's back to 0. But there's no way to fall further down from 0. He can't just try to get up from +5 again. At this point, Asuna seemed to understand where I was going with this. Her hazel eyes widened in the shade of her hood. Oh, there's a maximum limit to attempts. And what's the limit from an anneal blade? 8 times. He got 4 successes and 4 failures, which puts him at an even and used up all his attempts. That sword can't be smithed anymore. It was the trickiest part of SAO's weapon upgrading system. Every piece of equipment that could be powered up had a preset number of possible attempts. It wasn't the maximum level you could reach with the weapon, but the number of attempts. For example, a small sword starting weapon at the beginning of a game had a single potential attempt. If the process failed, the sword could never be small sword plus 1. Even worse, the success rate could actually be affected by the effort of the owner. Obviously, finding the best blacksmith possible was a major part of that, and ultimately, one could master the blacksmith skill themselves, though at this point in the game it was an unrealistic option. One could also increase the chances of success through better materials, either in quality or quantity. Most player blacksmiths set their upgrading fees based on the success rates of around 70%. If the clients wanted a better chance, they could pay extra to have more crafting materials added or simply provide them directly to the blacksmith, which meant the biggest fault of the three-horned man was that he'd gotten worked up and gambled on more attempts. He should have taken a deep breath after the first failure, then paid or provided extra to improve his chances for the next time. That would likely have prevented his tragedy of a Neil Blade plus 0 with no remaining attempts. I see. Well, I can understand that, why he'd be so upset. Just a little. I nodded in agreement and offered a moment of silence to the fatal blade. Suddenly, the screaming man ceased his rage. 2 of his friends had raced over and put their hands on his shoulders, offering support. Come on, Rufiel. It's gonna be okay. We'll help you try to make a Neilblade quest again. It's only gonna take 2 weeks to get back. Then we can push all the way up to +8. Wow, now it takes 3 players a week to get it. Glad I got mine early. I thought, and you guys, take care of your pal. Don't let him gamble it away again. Rufiel seemed to have recovered from his cool. He trudged off out of the plaza, shoulders slumped. The blacksmith, who withstood the insults in silence the entire time, finally spoke up. I'm truly sorry about this. I'll try much harder next time. I swear. I mean, not that you'd want to bring it to me again. Rufiel stopped and looked back at the blacksmith. When he spoke again, it was an entirely different voice. It's not your fault. I'm sorry for ripping you apart. No, I failed at my job. I looked closer at the blacksmith, who was still bowing and hands clasped in front of his leather apron. He was quite young, still in his teens. His slightly drooping eyes had plain, parted bangs, made him look, I hated to admit it, like a perfectly typical crafter. A little shorter and thicker, he'd been a perfect dwarf, or perhaps a gnome. He didn't have the beard. The blacksmith stepped forward and bowed deeply yet again. Um, it's nothing in return, but do you think I could buy back your +0 sword? And you'll blade for 8,000 gold. The onlookers murmured in surprise, and even I grunted at the offer. The current market price for a fresh anneal blade +0 was about 16,000 gold, so the offer was only half that, but Rufiel's weapon was spent, fresh out of upgrade attempts. The market price for a weapon like that probably halved again, down to 4,000 gold. It was an extremely generous offer. Rufiel and his friends, too, were stunned, but after a moment's conferral, they all nodded. The incident was over. The 3 partners and the crowd of onlookers were gone, and the rhythmic clanging of blacksmith's hammer echoed through the plaza. The blacksmith, not the dwarf, was producing a weapon on his anvil. Asa and I took a seat at the bench across the circular plaza and listened to the hammering. Normally, I wouldn't spend this much time here. I'd get my business done and zip back to the outside of the Urbis town limits. There were two reasons my plans had changed. For once, the presence of Asuna, one of the new people in Einkrad who wouldn't call me a dirty beater, meant that I could actually have a conversation and practice my increasingly rusty Japanese. The other reason was on my back. I'd come to power up my Neelblade plus 6. I'd overheard someone talking about a talented blacksmith setting up in the shop at the East Plaza of Urbis over in the small town of Marome just yesterday. I'd been thinking about it, and I think it's time to give my plus 7 a shot. So I got some crafting materials in order and changed my disguise for a trip to Urbis. The previous scene had given me a pause, however. In truth, it wouldn't be easy as standing up and walking over and help the blacksmith and asking him for an upgrade. We'd never met before, and I doubted he would say, "My hammer isn't meant to work on swords of a dirty beater." But the prior squabble had put some pressure on my decision. Another anneal blade had gone from +4 to +0 despite 70% success rate. It was mathematically possible, but a tragedy of the highest order for such a fine weapon. If the same fate befell my attempt, I might not lose my cool for the same way, but I'd definitely be sulking in my inn room for a good 3 days. Something told me that embarking upon my attempt with this pessimistic view would ensure that I wound it up with an anneal blade +5. Then I'd panic. Try again without providing more materials, and finish with a +4. There was no logical reason for my suspicion, but the gamble of attempted upgrades in MMOs was a topic that often defied logic. Well? I looked over at the questioning voice, still lost in thought. Huh? What? Don't play dumb with me. Why'd you force me to sit here? Asuna glared at me. Right. Sorry, just thinking. Thinking? Weren't you coming here to have that blacksmith work on your weapon, Kirito? How could you tell? I asked, startled. She shot me an exasperated look. When we were in Marone 2 nights ago, you said that you were hunting for red-spotted beetles in the Rocky Mountains to the east. That must have been for one-handed sword upgrading material. Oh, yeah, I sighed. What was that reaction for? I just can't believe I'm hearing this from the girl who didn't know how to read her party companion's name just 4 days ago. In a good way, I'm not being sarcastic. Apparently, Asuna believed my sincerity, as her expression softened and she murmured, "I have been studying a lot." For some reason, this admission had made me happy. I nodded excitedly. That's great! Really, in an MMO, knowledge makes all the difference when it comes to getting results. Anything you want to know, just ask. I was a former tester after all. I know everything from the items sold in towns up to the 10th floor and the different sounds of all the mobs. At this point, I realized the terrible mistake I was making. Just as I said, I was a former beta tester. But at the same time, I'd taken the persona of a dirty beater who hoarded information and used it solely for his own benefit. Many other high-level players despised me for this, not least of whom were the party member of the fallen knight Diaval. Even with the leather armor and bandana, someone who knew me could recognize my face close up, and they would assume that Asuna, sitting on the bench next to me, must be my partner. It was incredibly reckless of me to be talking about this in a crowded public space. Sorry, I just remembered something. I need to go. I excused myself, clumsily preparing to stand and rush off. The fencer stopped my shoulder with the lightest tap of her index finger and spoke in a low but firm voice. It's crazy and arrogant of you to think that you can bear the burden of all the hatred and jealousy toward the former testers. But that was your choice, so I won't say anything more on the subject. But I also wish you'd respect my decision as well. I don't care what other people think. If I didn't want people to think I was your friend, your companion, I wouldn't have spoken to you. Oh, jeez. You can see right through me, I muttered and sat back down on the bench. She had identified all my motives, from calling myself a beater at the boss chamber to my attempt to get up and flee just seconds ago. No use trying to hide now. I raised my hands in a brief surrender, and she grinned slightly beneath her deep hood. If you're a pro at Einkrad, then all my girls' academy upbringing makes me a pro at mental battles. As if I could read your avatar's face like a page in a book. Well, I'm sorry to have doubted you. So, be honest. Why are you hesitating on upgrading your weapon? I was coming here to do the very same thing, in fact. What? I looked down at Asuna's fragile blade in surprise. Her green hilted rapier in its ivory scabbard was called the Wind Flaret. I'd looted that sword from a monster and given it to her as an upgrade when we first formed our party, preparing for the first floor boss fight. It was a fairly rare item, with the potential to serve admirably until midway through the third floor if it was upgraded properly. Is that plus floor right now? I asked. She nodded. Did you bring any of your own upgrade mats? How many? I have 4 steel planks and 12 windswept needles. Oh, wow, nice work, but I did some mental calculations and groaned. But that means the chance of going to plus 5 is only going to be a bit over 80%. Aren't those good odds to risk? Normally, sure, but after what we just saw... I looked back across the plaza, the dwarfish blacksmith rhythmically pounding away. Asuna looked at him as well, and shrugged. The odds of a coin turning up heads is always 50%, no matter what happened the last time. What effect does the last person's consecutive failure have on you or me trying our hand? Well, nothing, but I couldn't come up with a good answer. But my mind was racing. Clearly, Asuna was a person of logic and reason, and she would accept my assertion that there were streaks and mojo when it came to gambling. Even my brain knew that there was no proof behind the bad feeling I was getting. But on the other hand, my right brain was screaming danger. It claimed that whether a Neoblade or Wind Flaret, the next weapon to be given to that blacksmith, regardless of extra boosts and bonuses, would end in failure. Listen, Asuna. I turned my body to face her directly and put the gravest as possible tone in my voice. What? You like 90% better than 80%, right? Well, sure, but you like 95% better than 90%, right? Well, sure, but then don't compromise. If you've already put in the work, then get those materials. Why not give it to one more round and get those odds up to 95? She gave me a very skeptical gaze for several long seconds. Then beat her long eyelashes slowly, as though realizing something. Yes, it's true that I hate compromising, but I hate people who are all talk and no walk just as much. Huh? Since you're so dead set on pursuing perfection, I assume you're going to lend me a hand, Kirito. The drop rate on Wind Flaret wasp needles is only 80% after all. Huh? Now, that's all settled. Let's go hunting. I think the two of us together can take down about 100 before nightfall. Huh? Asuna patted my shoulders and stood up, then squinted slightly, her shapely eyebrows knitting together, and delivered the finishing blow. Oh, and if we're going to hunt together, you must take off that ugly bandana. It looks absolutely hideous on you. 2. Because of the sword arts that were the greatest selling point of SAO, the game had far more humanoid monster types than any other MMORPG. This tendency didn't come into focus until the next floor, however. So there were still a wide variety of non-humanoid monsters on the first and second floor. The animal and plant mobs that couldn't use sword skills were much easier for newbies to deal with. But there were exceptions, of course. Most notable of those were monsters with dangerous side effects, like paralyzing toxins and corrosive acids. But aside from that, flying mobs were surprisingly tricky after all. There was no magic in SAO. The only means of attacking a target at a distance was throwing knives, and they were more like complementary weapon, not a primary source of damage. I had to admit there was something cool about the idea of sinking all my time into throwing knife skill and terrorizing all the flying mobs, but I didn't have the willpower to dedicate such an extreme build now that the game was deadly. On top of that, SAO's throwing weapons all had a finite amount, so if you ran out of knives in the midst of battle, tragedy awaited. Therefore, when Asuna the fencer called upon, more like forced, me to help her hunt flying wind wasps in the western zone on the second floor, with our very limited weapon range, there was only one thought on my mind. Ugh, this is going to be such a pain in the ass. Once we left the west gate of Urbis, I called up my equipment mannequin and unequipped the yellow and blue striped bandana. I looked up at the long black bangs hanging below my eyebrows and sighed in relief. My original SAO avatar had parted the hair in an attempt to escape those large bangs. But now that I'd been living with this for a month, it was the most comfortable and familiar look for me. Asuna watched me removing my costume and snorted. I can't believe you thought putting on one stupid bandana for a disguise would work. It won't work unless you hide your entire face or use face paint. Ugh. The latter term sent a painful shock through my memory. My face had been covered in thick black paint until 2 nights before, and it wasn't a cool tribal pattern on my cheek or a reverse cross on my forehead. No, it was something much, much, much more embarrassing, I thought. I didn't have the nerve to look up for myself. The only human player who saw me described me as a Kirimon, after the famous robotic cat character. My face was marked against my will the moment I accepted a certain quest, and the marks would not come off until I completed a certain quest. I worked myself to the bone, tears in my eyes to finish it up after 3 nights. When the whiskered old martial arts master finally erased the markings, there were no words to describe the joy and satisfaction of that moment. I was so happy. I even forgave him for the fact that cleaning them off was a simple wipe on the light brown rag from his robe pocket. For that reason, I'd lost a good 50 hours of forward advancement since the opening of the second floor. I rushed to the village of Marone, the current front line of player progress, where I met Asuna for the first time since the boss fight. She, of course, had no idea why I would give that odd reaction to her innocent suggestion, and stared at me suspiciously. I cleared my throat in a hurry. Good point. Maybe I should get one of those hooded capes for myself the next time I go to Urbis. Where did you buy yours? From an NPC in the western market of the Tanabigin. She trailed off. I felt flames pouring from her eyes. You'd better not buy the same thing. Then people will think we're a fixed party. Wear a burlap sack if you want to hide your face. Asuna turned her head away in a blinding huff, opened her menu, and tapped the equipment figure. The plain gray wool cape sparkled briefly and vanished, and her long, straight hair glimmered in the afternoon sun. It was the first time I'd seen her full face in 4 days, not since the battle of Ilfang, the Kobold Lord, and it was indescribably beautiful. It almost made me wonder if Akihiko Kayaba, the ruler of our new world, had made one careless mistake and left her face in its original avatar form. But if I ever said that aloud, she'd pound on me. Was the southeast of Urbis, so the southwest road was empty of adventurers. If it weren't for the whole game of death thing, being able to stroll with a beautiful girl in the midst of a video game would be the greatest gift God could give any teenage boy. Even if we were only going to farm wasps, for a royal pain-in-the-ass mission. People might confuse me for a PKer if I wear a burlap sack. Can I at least get the same cape, but in a different color? Negative. Yes, ma'am. I brought up my equipment, mannequin again, removed the leather armor and disguise, and put on a pitch-black coat of midnight I'd looted from the boss. Asuna seemed about to say something as she watched the long hem of the coat flap in the wind. But when our eyes met, she turned away in a huff. I started to wonder why I was even helping her gather upgrading materials. Then I remembered that it had been my own suggestion. On the other hand, wind wasps were worth the trouble thanks to their experience value. It would be a good source of points before dinner. Plus, no doubt Asuna would be generous enough to pay for dinner in place of her lodging fee. Sure, she would. The path ahead took us through a narrow ravine that split the fields of grazing oxen into north and south. Through that canyon was where we'd find the wasps. As I'm sure you already know, given that you've hunted a fair number of them, the wasp stingers have 2 or 3 second stun effects. Let's keep that in mind, that if the other gets stunned, we should immediately go in and take over for them. Got it, she said, then added, if you go too far south, you'll run into jagged worms, so watch out for that. Got it. Belated, I recalled that bit of info from the beta test. We crossed the natural stone bridge that spanned the 30-foot gorge, nervous despite its reasonable width, and sighed in a relief once we were across. I wonder what would happen if we fell off, Asuna asked. I shrugged my shoulders. I doubt you die, if you're over level 5, but the path out of the ravine is to the south. There are plenty of slimy monsters down there, so it'd take a while to get out. Oh. I thought I detected something other than relief in her face. As though sensing my suspicion, she turned away towards the valley and said, I was just thinking if we go up against a boss monster, scouting it out and leveling up, creating a strategy and all that, and still lose, that's one thing. But dying because you were careless and fell from a tall height would really suck. Yeah, in a normal MMO, dying from a fall would be a funny story. But not here, I murmured. But do you even think there's a way of dying in the real world that might make you say, well, I did my best, so I have no regrets? Whether it's a disease or an accident, I think you'd be left with just sadness and frustration. I mean, if there's any way to die in Aincrad and feel satisfied that you did what you needed to do, it would have to be... Sadly, my 14-year-old nerd's vocabulary failed me. My fingers wrinkled and my mouth opened and closed without a sound. Asuna mercilessly watched an entire sorry display and then gave a brief answer. Perhaps that wouldn't be so bad. Not that I'm eager to find out what that's like anytime soon. Yeah. In which case, we ought to put our best efforts in defeating the second floor boss. And helping me power up my weapon is part of that process. Yeah. Since we're both in agreement, let's get started. 102 hours. Asuna drew her rapier and headed in the opposite direction of the stone bridge, a small basin lined with low trees. 100 wasps in 2 hours? One every 72 seconds? For real. All I could summon in response was a half-hearted grunt of agreement. The wind wasps were black, with green stripes and a foot and a half long, easily making them larger than any insect on Earth, but among the smallest monsters found in Aincrad. Their HP and attack values were fairly low for a second-floor mob. However, it was very difficult to suppress the brain's primitive signal to flee when a bee larger than your head approached, brandishing a stinger the size of an ice pick. Hunting the wasps, therefore, became an exercise in mastering one's own instincts. It was for this reason that I'd been concerned about Asuna, who did not seem to take kindly to bugs. However, ha! Her rapier skill linear burned a silver line through space, unreliably piercing the weak abdomen band of a wasp. It screeched metallically and burst into polygonal shards. A list of experience, coal, and rewards appeared before my eyes, automatically for being in her party. 24, she shouted, looking over with what I suspected to be a confident glee in her eyes. My juices of rivalry energized. I turned toward a fresh new wasp in my right. It had spawned with me inside its aggro range, so as soon as the curved compound eye spotted me, it reared up high. The wasp stopped about 5 yards off the ground and then buzzed down with a heavy, stomach-churning vibration. If the wasp's body stayed straight, it would lunge for a bite attack, and if it curved like a hinge, it would use a poison stinger. That was the first step to dealing with the creature. But even after my considerable beta experience, with these and the more powerful storm hornets, I couldn't help but recoil in fear when they lunged. This time, I withstood the terror and noticed the bee had its abdomen exposed, signaling a stinger attack. I stood my ground. The wasp changed right before me, then briefly stopped to hover again. The massive, poison barb was glowing with a faint yellow light. I waited until that moment, and then jumped backward. The stinger shot forward with a mechanical clank, but found no purchase. Once the wasp missed, it would be far under a delay effect for a second and a half. Without missing a beat, I unleashed Vertical Arc, a 2-part sword skill. The blade carved out a V shape and hammered the wasp with a satisfying sound effect. The monster's HP gauge fell nearly 60%. Fresh out of its delay, the wasp flew up high again. It spun around and began another dive. This time, it hurtled body first, the sign of a bite attack. I sidestepped rather than waiting for the attack, and then raced after the bee when it passed by. It stopped and briefly hovered before its next turn, more than enough for me to catch it with a clean diagonal slant. One more vertical arc would finish it off the monster, but its cooldown icon was still lit at the bottom of my view. A follow-up slant could do the job if it hit its weak points, but from behind, the wasp's large wings were in its way. If I didn't strike a critical hit on its HP bar, it would still have a little bit left. I clicked my tongue in disappointment and launched a regular swing attack before the wasp delay wore off. Fortunately, I hit it before the bite started, reducing the wasp to pieces of blue glass. 22! I yelled, looking around for a fresh opponent. The fact that I was losing despite the edge and level and equipment was thanks to Asuna's high rate of critical hits. In other words, she was so accurate that she could hit the wasp in their weak points every single time. My vertical arc did 60% of the wasp's life bar with a normal hit, whereas Asuna's linear just over 50 for critical blow. But because that move was was a basic skill, it had a very brief cooldown time, meaning she could use it every single time the wasp was vulnerable. I could try to follow her lead and aim for crits with my basic attacks like slant and horizontal, but I just didn't have the confidence in my own accuracy. If I had an excuse, it was that my Anneal Blade plus 6 was spec'd 3S 3D, meaning that 3 points into sharpness and 3 into durability. On the other hand, Asuna's Wind Fleuret was plus 4, was 3A 1D, meaning that 3 points to accuracy and 1 to durability. That gave her an excellent bonus to critical hits, no doubt. But even taking that into account, an extremely high level of player skill and calm concentration was necessary to land every single hit as a critical attack, to say nothing of experience. I suspected that Asuna had spent a considerable amount of time fighting these giant wasps since reaching the second floor. Much of that had to do with farming the materials to upgrade her Wind Fleuret, but I thought there was something bigger behind that. It was about strengthening herself as a player, not just her stats. If she learned to jab the weak points of the nimble flying enemies, Land-bound monsters would seem slow and molasses as comparison. I recalled that Asuna said to me on our first encounter deep within the floor labyrinth. We're all going to die anyway. The only difference is when and where, sooner or later. Her eyes had shone with a dim light that saw not hope but despair at the end of her battle. That she was able to strive in search of a true strength, now filled me with joy. I could only hope that someday she'd stand atop the entire population, a shining example and a beacon of light to all. But having that said, I was not about to lose our competition to see who could kill 50 wasps first. Before we began the battle, Asuna had proposed a chilling bet. She would provide the dinner for tonight, but whoever could hunt 50 wasps first also got a free dessert, courtesy of the loser. I'd accept the challenge without thinking, and it wasn't until after we started that I realized what she was after. One of the NPC restaurants in Urbis sold a shortcake with an astonishing amount of sweet cream made from giant cow's milk, the local delicacy, and it was delicious, enough to make one forget about my favorite black bread with cream from the first floor. It was also expensive, enough to use a majority of the coal I'd earned from the hunt. That's what Asuna was after. If she bought the meal and I bought the dessert, I'd come out way, way behind. I had no choice but to emerge victorious. Rah! I raced after the freshest new wasp, a bellow ripping through my lungs. But the next moment, all the wind flew out of my sails when I heard the call out, 25! A 3-point margin. That was bad news. At the halfway mark, if we both continued at this pace, she'd pull away and leave me in the dust. If I couldn't find a way to kill them in 2 moves like Asuna, I would never make up the difference. I didn't have any other choice. After turning back to ensure Asuna was looking the other way, I gave my target an appraising stare. A black and green wasp hovered high and then plunged down at me. Its body was bent. The gleaming stinger extended. I followed the proper pattern, stopping in my tracks and inviting the enemy to strike, and miss before employing a vertical arc. 2 pleasing slashes rang out, but as usual, they only did 60% of its health. If the wasp pulled away, I couldn't finish it off in 2 moves, short of a lucky critical hit. I clenched my left wrist in a silent scream. Normally, I'd suffer a brief delay effect at the end of my sword skill, but my left fist began glowing with a red visual effect. When I held my side, largely automatically, my body jutted forward and pounded the wasp, which was already in a knockback state from the sword attack. The meaty thud that resulted was unlike the sound of any blade. My fist shot forward and caught the wasp in its round, bulging abdomen. Flash blow, a basic martial arts skill. The wasp lost another 20% of its HP. Poised again, the wasp zipped forward and out of reach. Its second dive was another stinger lunge. I had already recovered from my delay, and it was easy to evade the wasp and dispatched it with a simple slant. The time it took to defeat this wasp was nearly the same as 2 hits. At this point, depending on how quickly I could find the next monster, I had a chance. I had a chance. Eyes wide, I scanned for the formative polygon blob that signaled a new monster being generated into the environment and raced after it. 1 hour later, I sat on the grass, 50 wasps killed, burnt to a crisp by sheer exhaustion. Asuna walked over and patted me on the shoulder. Nice work, Kirito. There wasn't a hint of fatigue in her voice. She circled around in front and smiled. Well, let's go back to Urbis for our dinner. And when you buy me dessert, I'd like to hear all about that bizarre punching skill you were using. I had no response. The beautiful fencer leaned in for a critical finish. I can't wait to try that cake. A win's a win, even if it was only by 1 point. A boy must keep his promises after all. 3. Just as we arrived back at Urbis, bells rang crisp and clear from all over the town. signaling the arrival of night. It was a calm, slow melody with a hint of longing. 7 o'clock was about the time for players out adventuring in the wilderness to make their way back home. In the MMORPGs I'd played before SAO, 7 o'clock was just when the game was getting going. People would begin to log into the server around then, hitting peak traffic at about 10, with the hardest of souls lasting all through the night until morning. As a student of mandatory schooling age, I always logged out by 2 in the morning at the latest. I remembered looking into the jealousy at those who were preparing to race out for yet another round of hunting. Ironically, now that all I wanted to do was to be able to go back to school, I could stay out well past 2, until 5 or 8 o'clock in the morning if I chose. And yet, once it got dark outside, I always found my way back to town. Many times it was just to eat dinner and fill up on supplies before trudging out for another round of adventures until sunrise. The night I met Asuna in the labyrinth was such an occasion, but every time I saw that red, sinking sun through the outer perimeter of Aincrad, the sky changing from purple to navy blue, I could sit still. I had to walk back to civilization. As proof that this urge was not solely on my own mind, there were a number of players walking to the main street of Urbis, all wearing smiles of relief. Lively cheers erupted from the restaurants and bars on the side of the street, with an occasional toast or a song of dedication to another day of survival. This same scene occurred at towns and villages of the first floor, but it had been quite a while since I'd heard such unserved laughter. Perhaps never, since we'd been trapped in the Aincrad. This is the first time I've come back to Urbis at this time of day. Is it always like this? Or is today special? I asked Asuna. December 8th wasn't a holiday. She shot me a quizzical look, her beauty hidden beneath the wool cape once again. Both Urbis and Marome have been like this for several days. Have you been hiding both day and night? Well... She was probably asking if I really cared that much about being seen. As a matter of fact, I could visit Urbis even if I wanted to. If I was going to tell her about my martial arts skill, however, over dinner, I'd eventually get to this topic, but it was not something that I could be summed up briefly. You could say I was hiding, or maybe I wasn't, I stammered. Asuna's stare grew even more incredulous. Didn't I tell you you're being paranoid? We've passed dozens of people so far. You're not in disguise. You're not a single one has bothered you in the least. She was correct. My awesome striped bandana was not on display. My face and hair were just like normal, though the black coat was stashed away too. But I had a feeling that it was not a case a player recognizes me as Kirito the Beater and choosing to leave me alone, but that they were simply too full of relief and anticipation of dinner to bother spending any time examining one gloomy-looking swordsman out of many. I coughed lightly, subtly maneuvered myself to use Asuna as a cover. Well, perhaps. Anyway, back to the topic. Is this place always this lively at night? For no particular reason? Oh, I'm sure there's a reason. I shut my mouth. She shot me another look. In fact, you're responsible about 3/4 of that reason. Huh? Me? I sputtered. She sighed in a total exasperation. Look, isn't it obvious why everyone is smiling and laughing? It's because we're on the second floor. Which means... It wasn't a riddle. Everyone was much more nervous for the entire month we were trapped on the first floor. They were terrified that they might never see the real world again. I was one of them. But then the boss raid came together. We won first try and opened up the second floor. Everyone realizing that maybe we can beat this thing. That's why they're smiling. I'm just saying, we wouldn't be seeing this phenomenon if certain someone hadn't stood strong during the battle. Finally, I understood the point Asuna was making. but I was no closer to knowing how to react to that. I coughed again and grasped for something to say. I guess. Well, if you ask me, that certain someone did a good enough job to deserve a free shortcake. I finished hopefully. That was that. This is this. It was worth a shot. We turned into a narrow path leading north from the east-west main street. Then made another right and then a left to reach the restaurant. I knew this establishment and its infamous shortcake from my tireless exploration of Urbis during the beta test, so I was a bit surprised that Asuna knew about it after just a few days on the second floor. We took a table near the back and ordered our food, which at point I decided to ask her about what she knew. So let me guess, Asuna. The smell of the sweet cream, those brown eyes went sharp beneath her hood. I instantly changed course. Did not guide you here. So, is it a coincidence? It's a small storefront with a tiny sign. I think it would be difficult to pick a place at random. There wasn't anything to be lost by wandering into a business at random in Einkrad, as there were no rip-off bars that bullied you into paying up for just entering, as far as I knew. But there were some automatically initiated an event-type quest when you walked into the door. There was no danger to one's HP inside the town, again, as far as I knew. But such an event might come off as nasty surprise to someone not familiar with MMOs. I figured Asuna was not the type of person to appreciate or desire unexpected thrills. But her answer surprised me. I asked Argo if there were any low-traffic NPC restaurants in Urbis, and bought the answer from her. Sure enough, there was no one else in the restaurant. So Asuna opened her menu and unequipped the cape, letting her hair swinging free and with a sigh. Oh, I see. That makes sense. On the inside, I broke out into a cold sweat. I was the one who brought Asuna and Argo together. Technically, it was when Asuna borrowed the use of my bath at the farmhouse near Tolbana, and Argo had visited her with perfect timing. Despite my best efforts, they ran into each other at the bathroom. Much Asuna's shock. She screamed and ran out into the main room where I was sitting. You're not remembering something you shouldn't, are you? If so, I might need 2 cakes instead of 1. No, not remembering a thing, I replied instantly, vigorously shaking my head clear. Anyway, Argo might be quick and accurate with your information, but be careful around her. There's no entry for client confidentiality in her dictionary. Meaning, I could ask her to sell me all the information she has about you? It was too late to regret my slip of tongue now. Well, yeah, maybe. But it'll cost you a lot. I'm sure the whole bundle would cost you at least 3,000 coal. That's actually not as much as I expected. I bet I could raise that amount without much trouble. No, I'd buy all of yours in return. After all, she saw your... I shut my mouth so hard my teeth clicked. She grinned at me. My what? What I meant to say is... At that moment, a miracle occurred. The NPC waiter returned with dishes of food, saving me from certain catastrophe. The menu was a simple salad, stew, and bread, but this was the finest to be found on the second floor. Asuna's eyebrows emitted a threatening aura as we ate, but it disappeared as the time-long-awaited dessert arrived. As we agreed, Asuna paid for the dinner, while the cost of the dessert came from my own wallet. The terrifying thing was, the cost of one dish easily exceeded the 3-piece dinner for 2. But given that I busted my secret martial arts skill and still lost the bet, I wasn't in any position to complain. My only option was to rue the lack of my own skill. The triumphant winner, seemingly oblivious to my inner turmoil, looked at my green plate, piled high with a mountain of cream, her eyes sparkling. Oh gosh, Argo's info said that you just have to try the Tremble shortcake once. I can't believe the moment has finally come. The tremble in the name was clearly derived from the trembling cows, the female versions of terrifying huge auctions that roamed the second floor. The cows were nearly twice the size of the oxen, practically bosses of their own right. The cream piled atop the shortcake came from their milk, supposedly. But now, that was not the time to mention that. There was another angle of the trembling monocure. However, the cream was piled so high atop the dish that it shook on its own. The piece was triangular slice of a full-size round cake, 7 inches side to side, 3 inches tall, about 60 degrees of the whole. That meant the total volume of the cake was 7 times 7 times 3.14 times 3 divided by 6, totaling about 77 cubic inches of pure heaven. There had to be almost an entire quart of ice cream on that thing. So, what about this cake qualifies as short? I whined. Asuna picked up a large fork that came with the cake and said, "You don't know. That's not called a shortcake because it's short in stature." "Oh, why then? Was it invented by a legendary big league shortstop?" She effortlessly ignored my killer joke. "It's because the crispy texture of the cake is achieved by shortening. In America, they use a tough, crispy biscuit-like cake as the base, but we have a soft sponge cake in Japan. It's not really accurate to the original meaning. Let's see what kind this is." She put her fork on top of the triangular wedge and caved out a good 5 cubic inches, exposing the golden sponge cake. It was a 4-layered cake, going sponge, strawberries, and cream, sponge, strawberries, and cream. On top of that cake, of course, was covered in stunning amount of strawberries, or more accurately, some kind of in-game fruit that resembled strawberries. "So, it's a sponge cake. I like the style more anyway," Asuna said. Her smile was so radiant that it almost was worth losing the bet and being forced to pay a massive dessert bill just to see it. In truth, it didn't matter whether it came out of ahead or behind, in fact. She'd gotten from the pale-faced despair in the depths of the labyrinth to a full-faced smile under these warm oil lamps was a very good thing indeed. If there was one very bad thing here, it was that there was only a single slice of cake on the table. I had been planning to live dangerously in order 2 servings outright, but the price on the menu was like a bucket of ice water dumped over my enthusiasm. I summed up every last point of my gentleman's statistics and waved a magnanimous hand, smiling as naturally as I could. "Please, dig in. Don't mind me." She smiled back. "Oh, I won't. Here goes." 2 seconds later, she cracked with laughter, and then reached into the cutlery basket at the side of the table and handed me a fork. "I'm just kidding. I'm not that mean. You can have up to a third of it." Thanks," I replied, a relieved smile on my face. On the inside, my brain was doing rapid calculations. 1/3 means I can eat 27.5 cubic inches of cake. When we left the restaurant, the town was wreathed in the dark of night. Asuna sucked in a deep breath and let out a deep sigh of contentment. That was good. I knew how she felt. That cake was probably the first honest dessert she'd tasted since we'd been trapped in this place. It was the same for me. I sighed happily as well, and murmured, "It feels like that tasted even better than it was in the beta. The way that the cream melted in the mouth, the perfect level of sweetness that wasn't too heavy, but still satisfying. Don't you think that's just your imagination? Would they really bother to fine-tune such a thing between the beta and retail release?" she asked. I answered her skepticism with all seriousness. It wouldn't be too hard to update the data in the taste engine. Besides, even ignoring the difference in flavor, we didn't have this in the beta. I pointed just below my HP bar in the upper left-hand portion of my view. There was a buff icon displayed that hadn't been there before. A 4-leaf clover that signified a luck bonus. That affected could only be gained by making an expensive offering at a church, or equipping an accessory with that particular bonus, or consuming a special food item. SAO kept its main stats seemingly minimal, showing only values for strength and agility. However, there were a number of hidden stats affected by equipment properties, buffs and debuffs, even terrain effects. Luck was one of those stats, and pretty important one. It affected the resistance to poison and paralysis. The probability of a weapon fumbling or tripping, even potentially the drop rate of rare items. No doubt someone in Argus developed team had taken a look at the exorbitant price of the shortcake and decided that it was enough to warrant a bonus effect when the retail game launched. The effect would last 15 minutes. That would be a handy amount of eating a snack in the middle of a dungeon. Unfortunately, it's not enough time for us to make a good use of it out in the fields, Asuna said, clearly following my line of thought. Even if we ran out searching for monsters, we'd barely find a handful before the buff wore off. Plus, the monsters around the outskirts of the town didn't drop any decent loot. Too bad. What a waste of a good buff. I stared at the icon timer ticking away precious seconds, racking my brain for a way to make good use of the bonus while it lasted. We could get down on our hands and knees in the street. Coins and fragments of gems could be found on very rare occasions. But I didn't think Asuna would like that. We could gamble at a big casino, except they didn't start showing up until the 7th floor. The more I pondered, the less effect remained. Wasn't there anything we could do to test our luck? I suppose I could turn to the fencer and ask if she'd go out with me, but I had a feeling the luck bonus had no bearing on chances there. Just as the steam was about to pour out of my ears in frustration, I heard a sound. It was the distant, rhythmic clanging of metal. Clank, clank, went the hammer. I snapped my fingers, finally having spotted a use for the 12 remaining minutes of good luck. 4. 5 hours after our last visit to the eastern plaza of Urbis, there were virtually no people wandering around. The only souls left were a few players standing around the NPC shops and stalls that opened at night, and 2 or 3 couples settled on benches. Of course, I hadn't brought Asuna here to sit on a bench and stare up at the bottom of the floor above in lieu of stargazing. The short player was still there at the northeast corner, his small anvil and display case sitting on top of the vendor's carpet. This was who I came to see, the blacksmith, likely very committed crafter since the start of SAO. Asuna, you met your quota of upgrading the materials of your wind florette during our hunt, right? I asked. She gave me a brief nod, her hooded cape back on. Yes, I'm a bit over, in fact, so I was planning to sell the rest and split the money with you. We can do that tomorrow. Why don't you try getting it to +5 right now? She looked upward, thinking it over. I see, but does the good luck bonus affect weapon augmentation attempts? Isn't it the blacksmith who does the attempt, not me? True, but we can't give the blacksmith some cake, for obvious reasons. Obvious meaning financial reasons. I shrugged and continued. So I can't claim the effect will work, but you are the weapon's owner, so maybe the boost to the chance of success. Certain it won't have a negative effect, so you might as well give it a shot. The explanation had wound to buff the timer down to 7 minutes. Asuna nodded again, and I said, all right, I was going to do it today anyway. She pulled the rapier from her waist and strode directly over to the blacksmith display. I followed her without comment. Up close, the diminutive blacksmith reminded me even more of a dwarf. He was short and squat and young, an honest face. It was a real shame that he didn't have any whiskers. Hairstyles and facial hair were easily customizable with cosmetic items from the NPC shops, so it seemed like you could draw in more customers going with the classic look. Asuna's voice broke me out of my pointless reverie. Good evening. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil and gave a hasty bow. Good evening. Welcome. His voice was young, boyish, a far cry from that dwarven baritone. Every avatar's voice was sampled from player's real-life voice. so while it seemed slightly different from his face, it didn't change his overall impression. As I suspected, the first time I saw him, he might be a teenager close to my age. Atop the signboard with his list of supplies, it said Nezha's Smith Shop. Under Japanese rules, I suspected that this to be pronounced Nezuha. It must have been his name. Something it was difficult to tell with the alphabetical display of Sword Art Online player names. In our first floor raid party, there was a Trident user with the handle Hokaikura. After much deliberation, I concluded that it must be Hoka Ikura, only to find out later that he called himself Hokai Ikura. Nezha itself could have some different pronunciations, but it seemed rude to ask him on our first meeting. At any rate, Nezha, the blacksmith, got to his feet and bowed again nervously. "Are you looking for a new weapon here, or for maintenance?" Asuna held up her rapier in both hands and answered. "I'd like you to power up my weapon. I want this wind fleuret +4 boosted to +5 bonus to accuracy. I've got my own materials." Nezha took one glance at the fleuret, and his already drooping brows looked even more troubled. "All right, how many materials do you have?" "The upper limit, 4 steel plates and 20 wind wasp needles," she answered promptly. I recalculated everything in my head. Equipment upgrade materials came in 2 categories: base materials and additional materials. Every attempt had a fixed mandatory cost of base materials, but the additional materials were optional. The type of number and addition of mats would have a wide effect on the chances of success. Wind wasp needles were an accuracy bonus in addition to materials, which meant that they would increase her critical hit chance even more. If my memory is correct, a full 20 needles would max out a success rate of an upgrade attempt at 95%. In other words, this would have been a very good thing for the player actually performing the upgrade attempt. The best customers of all would pay the blacksmiths for the materials themselves, but it still had much better than failing with no additional mats. And yet, Nezha looked terrified after hearing her answer. He was clearly unsettled by the request, but he couldn't find a reason to turn her down. "All right, I'll take your weapon and materials." He bowed again. Asuna thanked him and handed over the wind fleuret first. She opened her window and then materialized a sack, which she had placed all the goods. She handed them over to the blacksmith through a trade window. Finally, she paid him the cost of upgrading the attempt. At this point, the luck bonus had 4 minutes left. That would not be much help in battle, but it was more than enough in a single weapon upgrade. Whether or not it actually worked in the way she hoped was another question, but it was one expensive piece of cake. Surely they could afford to bump us up from 95 to 97. I said a silent prayer to the god of the game system. Asuna took 2 steps back and sided right next to me. She muttered, "Finger." "Huh?" "Stick your finger out." Baffled, I lifted my left hand and extended the index finger. Asuna reached out with her brown leather gloves and gripped my finger with 2 of hers. What is this?" "If I do this, maybe your buff effect will be added to mine." "That seems stupid." "Well, in that case, shouldn't you hold my entire hand?" I felt an icy stare emanating from her body. "Since when were things like that between us?" "Since when were they like this?" I wanted to yell, but the blacksmith signaled that he counted all the materials and he found them satisfactory. So I had to stay quiet and let her squeeze my fingertip, draining away my valuable good luck. Asuna and I watched over the sign as Nezha the blacksmith turned and reached for a portable furnace set next to his work anvil. The number of ingots it could melt at once was very low, meaning he could create a large pole arms or suit of metal armor, but it did the job for a simple street-side business. On the furnace pop-up menu, he switched it up from creation mode to strengthening mode, and then set the type of augmentation. Nezha then tossed Asuna's materials into the furnace. 4 thin sheets of steel and 20 sharp stingers turned red and burst into flames in seconds. And soon after, the furnace began burning with a blue flame that signified the accuracy stat. All preparations complete, he removed the wind fleuret from its sheath and set it down within the brazier-shaped furnace. The blue flames enveloped the slender blade, and the entire weapon was soon glowing azure. Neza quickly pulled the rapier out and laid it on top of the anvil, and then gripped the hander and held it high. At that exact moment, something pricked the hairs on the back of my neck. It was the same sensation that I'd felt earlier that afternoon when I decided to hold off upgrading my anneal blade +6. I opened my mouth, preparing to yell, "Stop!" But the blacksmith hammer had already made its first strike. Clang! Clang! The rhythmic pounding echoed throughout the square, orange sparks flying from the anvil. Once the upgrade attempt had begun, there was no stopping it. Well, I could grab his hand and force him to stop, but that would only guarantee that it would end in failure. All I could do now was watch and pray for the success. There was no foundation for my panic. It was all a manifestation of inner worwort. Nothing more. All the materials had been invested. The blacksmith represented better odds than an NPC, and we had 2 players worth of luck bonus. We couldn't possibly fail. I held my breath and watched the hammer go up and down. Unlike with weapon creation, 10 strikes were necessary to upgrade a weapon. 6, 7, the hammer smacked the blue rapier at a steady pace. 8, 9, 10, the process complete. The rapier flashed brightly atop of the anvil. There is no way it can fail, I repeated to myself, gritting my teeth. The result was far worse than my bad premonition could possibly have signaled. With a fragile, even beautifully tinkling, the wind fleuret plush floor crumbled into dust from the tip to the hilt. No one reacted for several seconds. From Asuna, the sword's owner, to me, the emotional and luck bonus support, to Neza, the blacksmith, the one who had caused it to happen. Perhaps if a single passerby had been watching, they might have broken the ice. But for now, all 3 of us could do was stare emptily at the anvil. At the third party in its transaction, perhaps, I was best suited to smooth over the situation. But my mind was occupied by one massive question, not to mention the sheer shock of what had transpired. This is ridiculous! The phrase echoed through my head over and over. All I could do was stare. It was impossible. As far as I knew, there were only 3 negative outcomes of a weapon upgrade attempt in SAO. The materials disappeared and left the already upgraded values where they were. The properties and the bonus got switched around, or the upgraded values decreased by 1. In worst case scenario, Asuna's wind fleuret +4 should have decreased to +3. And that was, at most, a 5% chance. Of course, 5% put it well within the bounds of possibility to end an MNO, but it could never result in a weapon just completely disintegrating. But there was no getting around the brutal truth that the glittering shards of silver scattered around the anvil had been, until a few seconds ago, Asuna's precious sword. I watched an entire series of events. Asuna removed the rapier from her waist and handed it to Neza. He picked it up and left the hand manipulated the portable furnace to his right, and then pulled the sword from the scabbard and put it in the fire. Nothing in the sequence of event was out of the ordinary. As we watched in silence, the scattered pieces around the furnace melted into the air. The weapon damaging skills that some monsters used might whelp, warp, or chip a blade, but leave it repairable state. A weapon that shattered into pieces represented the loss of all durability, and was irretrievably gone. Asuna's sword wasn't just destroyed, it had been deleted from SAO server's database entirely. As the final fragment disappeared, it was Neza, the blacksmith, who moved first. He threw aside his hammer and bolted to his feet, bowing to the both of us over and over. His parted bowl cut Waving in the air, he squeaked and wailed, trying to trap the scream in his throat. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll return all of your money. I'm so sorry. Asuna couldn't react to the repeated apologies. She just stood there with her eyes wide. I eventually stepped forward to speak. Look, before we talk about money, I want an explanation. I thought that weapon destruction was an impossible failure state of upgrading an SAO. How did this happen? Neza stopped bobbing his head and looked up. The angle of his hanging eyebrows was extreme, his round, honest face screwed up in agony. It was as though his face had been designed as an expression of pure apology. It felt extremely uncomfortable, but there was no way I could tell him that it was all right. Instead, I tried to keep my voice as calm and humanly as possible. Listen, I played in the beta test, and I remember the player manual they put in the official website. It said that there were 3 possible penalties for failure: loss of materials, property alteration, and property downgrade. That's a fact. As a publicly outed beater, I had no desire to bring up the beta, but this was not the time for self-preservation. I stopped there and waited for his answer. Neza, who was no longer bowing and scraping, but his eyesight was fixed firmly downward as he spoke, his voice trembling. I think that maybe they added a 4th penalty type for the launch. This happened to me once before. I'm sure the probability is very low, but I had no argument left. And if Neza's claim was false, then he'd somehow just accomplished a destruction penalty that did not exist in the game. That was far more unlikely. I see, I muttered, lifelessly. Neza looked up and mumbled again. I'm truly sorry. I don't know how to repay you. I'd give you a replacement win for it, but I don't have any in stock. I'd hate to leave you without an option. So I can give you an iron rapier if you don't mind the downgrade. That wasn't my choice to make. I looked to my left, the still, silent Asuna. Her face was almost entirely hidden by the gray hood, but I could still make out her delicate chin moving side to side. I answered Neza for her. No thanks. We'll make do on our own. With all due credit, Neza offer, the iron rapier, was sold far back at the town of beginnings for the first 4. It wasn't going to be very helpful up here. If he couldn't give us the wind floret, the guard rapier that was 1 rank below it, it was the only thing that came close to a replacement. Besides, the risk of failing an augmentation attempt should fall upon the shoulders of the client, not the blacksmith, carrying the job out. Neza's shop sign had listed the success rates for various jobs at his current skill level, and being unlucky enough to hit a 5% chance would probably less than 1% chance for the worst of his outcomes. A failure of our problem, not his. Even Refuel, he of the Anneal Blade Plus 0 disaster of this afternoon, had eventually given in and accepted his fate. Neza's shoulders slumped even lower to my answer. He murmured, I see. Well, at least let me return your fee. He moved his hand to start a transfer, but I cut him off. It's all right. You did your best. You don't need to do this. There are some crafters who say it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you hit the weapon enough times. So they just whack away. I didn't mean anything by that, but for some reason, he shrunk his head even farther. His arms were held close to his body as possible, and trembling fiercely. Another apology shuddered out. I'm sorry! After that painful, heart-rending apology, there was nothing more to say. I took a step back, nodded to Asuna, and started to move her away. It was only at this moment that I noticed that her hand, which had been pinching my index finger originally, was now fully gripping my palm. I pulled the silent Asuna away from the blacksmith, out of the northern entrance of the plaza. There were a few NPC shops, or of unknown utility. Perhaps they would make available as player homes after some later point in the game. At any rate, the street was nearly empty. We walked on and on, the only point of interest an occasional signboard of an inn. There was no destination, not even of a general direction. The cold grip of her hand on mine told me of how heavily the loss of her favorite sword was weighing on her, and the shock of its abrupt disappearance after a single upgrade attempt. But I had no idea how to react or console her. My meager life experience of a middle school gamer left me unprepared for this. All I knew was that pulling my hand free and running away was the worst possible choice. I wanted to pray for the advent of some hidden salvation, but the good luck bonus icon below my HP bar was long gone. First, let's stop walking. I noticed a wider space ahead, with a bench, and started off for it. After a few dozen steps, I stopped awkwardly and said, "Look, here's a bench." The voice inside my head screamed at me for being an idiot, but Asuna sensed my intentions and turned to sit down without a word. She was still holding my hand, so I automatically took the spot beside her. After a few seconds, her fingers eased up and left my own hand on the wooden slats of the bench. I had to say something, but the more I thought, the tighter my throat shrank. How could I be the same person who had stood up before dozens of powerful warriors and proclaimed myself as a beater? And not just that, I was the one who had spoken first when I originally found Asuna deep within the first floor labyrinth, wearing a much harder expression than she was now. Sure, it had been an emotionless admonishment about overkill, but there was no reason I could say something and then couldn't now. Not at all. Um, so I began. Fortunately, the words seemed to form themselves after that point. It's a real shame about the wind florette. But once we reach the next town, after Marome, they sell a weapon that's even a bit better. It's not cheap, of course, but we can manage it together. I'll help you save up. If mana points existed in this world, it would have cost me every last one of mine to get those words out of my mouth. Asuna responded, so quietly I could barely hear her, even at this close range. But the words melted in air as quickly as it appeared. But that sword was my only... Something in her voice, some emotional response, pulled my gaze directly to her face. Two clear drops ran down her cheeks, glowing with a pale light under the hood. It wasn't as though I'd never seen a girl crying up close, but that source of those tears was always my little sister, Sagura, and almost as all instances had occurred years ago in my kindergarten and early grade school years. The last time I'd seen her cry was 3 months before I fell prisoner to SAO. She'd lost the prefectural kendo tournament and cried in the corner of our backyard. I had no words to console her, only a bag from the convenience store with ice pops, the kind you suck from the plastic wrapper. I broke into two and stuck one of the halves into her hand. In gaming terms, my proficiency in reacting to crying girls was barely above zero. If I'd been unlocked that skill in the first place, I had no compliment myself on even having the guts to stay here rather than run off. On the other hand, an objective look showed me in a very pathetic light, frozen still and dumbfounded, watching the tears streak down Asuna's cheek, one after the other. I ought to speak, or move, but I had no ice pops in my inventory, and I wasn't ready to speak with her when I was entirely sure what she was crying about. I understood the shock of seeing her favorite weapon crumble to pieces before her eyes. Of course, if my anneal blade suddenly vanished, I'd probably get into tears in my eyes as well. But in all honesty, I didn't peg Asuna as the type to form a deep attachment to her weapon. See is an extension of herself. Talk to it soothingly as she oiled it. That was my category, if anything. Asuna seemed like the opposite case. She would see a sword as simply one element of battle power out of several. If she looted a slightly stronger sword from a dead monster, she'd toss it aside, the one she'd been using without a second thought. The first time I met her, she had bundled a starting rapier that she'd bought in town, throwing each one away when it was no longer in use. It had only been a week since. What had changed Asuna of thinking 180 degrees in just 7 days? No matter the reason. There was no use wondering about it now. She was shedding tears over her partner, the blade she'd used for 7 whole days. I could understand her sorrow. What else was there to think about? It's a real shame, I muttered. Asuna back shivered. She seemed more doll-like than ever. But listen, I continued. I know this might sound cold, but if you want to keep fighting in the front lines to help beat this damn game, you're going to have to keep getting new equipment. Even if that had worked, your wind florent would be useless by the end of the 3rd floor. I'll have to replace my own anneal blade to the first town on the 4th floor. That's just what MMOs and what RPGs are like. I had no idea if this was actually comforting her, but it was the best I could do. Asuna did not react for several moments. After I finished speaking, finally, a few words trickled out of her hood. I can't take that. Her right hand clenched lightly atop her leather skirt. I always thought my sword was just a tool, a bunch of polygon data. I thought that only my skill and determination mattered here. But the first time I tried out that wind florent you chose for me, I'm ashamed to admit, I was blown away. It was as light as a feather and seemed to home right into the spot I wanted to hit, as if the sword was helping me out of my own will. Her cheeks trembled. A fleeting smile crossed her lips. For some reason, this seemed like the most beautiful expression I had seen Asuna make yet. As though I'll be fine as long as I have her. I'd have her by my side forever. I told myself, even if the upgrading fails, I'd never get rid of her. I'd take great care of her. For all the swords I wasted before this, I promised. Fresh tears dripped into her skirt and vanished. When things disappear in this world, they left no trace behind. Swords, monsters, and even players. Asuna quietly shook her head and whispered, her voice barely audible. If what you say is true, and I have to keep switching to new weapons, then I don't want to go upward. I feel so bad. We fight together, survive together. I can't bear just throwing it away. Something in Asuna's words brought back a memory of an entirely different scene. A child's bicycle with a black frame, 20-inch tires, a 6-gear shifter. I picked it out for myself on the day I entered elementary school. I treasured that junior mountain bike more than any child would. I put air in the tires once a week. If it rained, I wiped it off and oiled the moving parts. Perhaps borrowing Dad's bike care chemicals to waterproof the frame was going a bit overboard. Thanks to all that, the bike was still sparkling like new after 3 years. But that was the root of my predicament. Once I outgrew my bike, my parents said that they would buy me a new one with 24-inch wheels, but rather than allowing me to keep my precious first bike in storage, they had to give it away to a younger boy in the neighborhood. I was in 3rd grade at the time, and I fought back like I'd never fought before. I claimed that I'd rather not have a new bike at all. I even asked the fellow neighbor bike shop store to keep it away for a secret from me. Instead, he told me that he'd transfer the soul of my machine to a new bike. Before my stunned eyes, he took out a hexagonal wrench and removed the bolt from the right crank. This bolt was the most important out of all of them, he claimed, so that as long as he stuck that on a new bike, its soul would come with it. Today, it was obvious, a bunch of baloney meant to quiet a child, but that first bolt and another one for my second bike were currently sitting at a saddlebag on my 26-incher. With this past experience in mind, I told Asuna, there's a way to keep your soul's soul within you when time comes to say goodbye. Huh? She raised her head just a bit. I held up 2 fingers. 2 ways, in fact. For one, you can melt down your inferior sword into ingots, and then use the base for a new sword. The other way is just to keep your old sword in storage. There are downsides in both cases, but I think there's merit to them. Downsides how? Well, when it comes to turning them into ingots, you have to have a strong willpower when you loot good weapons from the monsters. If you switch over to a looted sword that ends in a bloodline there, you could always melt down the loot and mix them together for your new sword, but it'll cost a lot. On the other hand, if you keep it in your inventory, that using up valuable space. Again, your willpower will be tested when you're deep in a dungeon and you run out of space for items. In either case, the more practical players will probably laugh and wonder why you bother. Asuna was looking down, deep in thought, and then raised her head and brushed a tear away with her fingertip. And did you plan to do either of those? I'm on the ingot side, but I should explain. If I do it for my armor and accessories too, not just my sword. Oh. She nodded and smiled again. This one was a bit clearer than the last, but the air of sadness still had not vanished from her face. If only I could have kept the shattered pieces so they could be melted down, she murmured. I could only nod in agreement. The first sword Asuna had felt a connection to was gone forever, without a trace. There was no way of bringing that soul back. I was lost in silence. Eventually, she spoke again. Thanks. Huh? She didn't repeat herself. Asuna stretched her legs forward and stood up from the bench. It's getting really late. Let's head back into the inn. And will you help me buy a new sword tomorrow? Yeah, of course. I nodded, hastily getting to my feet. I'll, see you to your inn. She shook her head at my offer. I don't feel like walking back to Marome. I'll stay in Urbis tonight. There's a place just over there. I turned and saw that indeed. There was a gently glowing sign that said inn. Upon further reflection, it would be too dangerous to walk through the wilderness between towns without a decent weapon. Leaving her here for tonight and coming back tomorrow to help her buy a new weapon seemed like a much better idea. I walked her to the door of the inn, about 20 yards away, and watched her check in, waving as she walked up the stairs. I didn't have the guts to stay at the same inn with her. Besides, there was one other thing for me to do tonight. I headed south, back down the street toward the Eastern Plaza to Urbis. 5. When the bell rang out 8 o'clock, the tireless clanging of the hammer finally stopped. I rushed to the gate at the East Plaza of Urbis and made my way across the open space, avoiding the lighting radius of the street lamps. I reached the line of leafy trees planted at the eastern border and put my back against the thick trunk. In my player menu, there was a shortcut icon at the bottom of the main screen that corresponded to my hiding skill, which was set in my third skill slot. A small indicator appeared in the bottom of my view, reading 70%. My avatar was now 70% blended into the tree at my back. A number of variables affected that number. My armor type and color, surrounding terrain and brightness, of course, my own movement. I was risking the exposure of my evil beater persona by wearing the black coat of midnight. But the black leather coat's bonus to hiding would be more of use than my usual disguise. The area was dark, and there was no one else nearby, maximizing my stealth efficiency. The number 70 wasn't great because my hiding proficiency was still low. Increasing that skill was a long and boring process, so I wouldn't max it out for quite a long time. Even at a starter status, the skill was powerful enough to work easily against mobs on the first 2 floors, as long as they were site dependent, but that number felt awfully low against a human being. A perceptive player like Asuna would probably see through to 70% camouflage without any trouble. On top of that, hiding in town was considered poor manners, so getting revealed by other players could lead to trouble, especially if I was one of the recent game police type, who took it upon themselves to uphold proper etiquette. It wasn't my style to sneak around and spy on people, but this was a special circumstance. Was about to embark on my very first attempted trail of another player. As I waited behind the tree, a player crafter closed up his shop, and the 8 o'clock bell. It was Neza, of course, the first blacksmith of Einkrad to sell his wares in the street. He extinguished the fire in his portable forge and put away the ingots in his leather sack. His hammer and other smithing tools went into a special box. He folded up the side and set it down on an empty spot on the carpet, then straightened out his display for weapons for sale. Once every object related to his business had been neatly packed on top of a 6x6 carpet, Neza tapped the corner to bring up a menu screen and hit Store button. The carpet rolled up by itself, absorbing the countless items on top of it. In just a few seconds, the only thing left was a thin, round tube. The short blacksmith picked it up easily and hoisted it over his shoulders. The magic vendor's carpet was always the same weight, no matter what items were locked within the internal storage. When I first learned about that, visions of unlimited space for potions, food, and loot in the dungeon floated through my head, but reality was not so generous. The carpet only worked in towns and villages. On top of that, it couldn't be fit into a player's inventory, meaning that the 4-foot-long, 4-inch thick rolled carpet had to be carried everywhere by hand. Normally, this item bore little use for non-merchant or crafters, but some enterprising people found unexpected avenues for fun. Back in the beta, there was a brief period where pranksters used the item on carpet cannot be moved by anyone but the owner rule to block off major streets with large furnitures, sowing the chaos left and right. This was addressed very quickly in a patch that limited the use of the carpets to the corners of the public spaces over a certain size. Magic carpet on his shoulder, Neza heaved a sigh of exhaustion and started plodding off to head down toward the south gate of the square. I waited for him to be at least 20 yards away and then pulled away from the tree. My hide rate indicator dropped rapidly until it hit 0, at which point the hiding icon disappeared entirely. I still stayed in the shadows, trying to cut down on any unnatural footsteps as I trailed him. Of course, I was not following Neza home in order to confront him about his failure to improve Asuna's weapon, or to threaten him away from prying eyes. If anything, it was that feeling of wrongness. As far as I knew, he had failed 5 times, to upgrade a weapon over the course of a day. The destruction of Asuna's wind fleuret and the 4 consecutive tries on Rufilio's Neelblade rendered it spent, +0. Of course, this outcome was possible from a statistical standpoint, but it struck me as a little too easy, or a little too hard, depending on how you looked at it. The only reason I'd visited the Eastern Plaza of Urbis in disguise in the first place was because I heard rumors in Marome that an excellent blacksmith had set up shop there. I packed up enough materials to boost my chances to 80% and was pondering about the bump up in sharpness or durability when I happened across the scene with Rufiel. I would have gone up to him directly afterwards to have my weapon upgraded, if it hadn't happened to run into Asuna at that precise moment. Would my weapon have failed just like theirs? It couldn't help but feel that way, although I had no proof backing up my suspicion. If rumors of his skill had reached Marome, then Neza's chances of success must be noteworthy. There was no way to test for myself, but his numbers must surely be better than the standard NPC blacksmith. However, if he was somehow able to fulfill a condition that guaranteed failure, there must be some hidden reason behind it. It was possible that some miraculous trick lurked behind this series of events. This was all personal conjecture, perhaps even paranoid suspicion. Even if there was some kind of knack that he was doing, I couldn't possibly guess how it worked. How had put Asuna's material into the forge, heated her sword in it, and then moved it to the anvil and hammered it, all before my eyes. It was all according to the book, nothing out of place. Besides, what could he possibly stand to gain by downgrading or destroying other players' weapons? Even as the possibilities swirled through my head, I kept a bead on his back as he walked. Fortunately, he seemed to have no idea he was being followed. It didn't spin around or force me to come to an awkward halt. On the other hand, I had no experience trailing another player, so a cold sweat ran down my back the entire time. If I got my hiding skill higher, I could follow at a much greater distance without trouble. But at this point, the only experience I could rely on was spy movies. I darted stylishly from shadow to shadow for 7 or 8 minutes, a certain impossible theme song ringing in my ears. Neza plodded his way almost to the town walls at the southeast edge of Urbis before stopping at a faintly glowing sign. I stuck close to the tree, lying in the street to watch. Anyone witnessed this scene would find it extremely suspicious, but I didn't realize that until later. The sign clearly said, "Bar," in the light of the oil lamps. Again, I felt a strange suspicion. Nothing was out of place for a hard worker player to settle down with a drink after a long day of work. But something was wrong with Neza's demeanor. He wasn't racing up the steps in anticipation of a nice cold mug of ale. In fact, he stood outside the swinging doors for over 10 seconds, as though hesitating to even go inside. He's not going to turn around, is he? I thought in a panic. Neza adjusted the roll of the carpet on his shoulders, and then set a heavy foot forward. He put out his hand and slowly pushed the door open. His small form disappeared into the bar, the door swinging shut behind him. It only took 2 seconds, but even at my distance, I could faintly hear what came from inside. There were a great cheer and applause, and a man's voice shouting, "Welcome back, Nezu!" I sucked in a deep breath. This was not what I expected. My spur-of-the-moment decision had trailed Neza, was only meant to find where he was spending the night. Instead, I went to the bar at the edge of the town where at least 4 or 5 people knew him personally. What could that mean? After a brief hesitation, I left the shadows and raced up to the swinging door of the inn. Fortunately, even with my back to the wall next to the door, I could hear nothing from inside. By nature, all closed doors in the game were soundproof. The only way to hear through them was by eavesdropping skill. Even the swinging door, with its wide open gaps above and below, was no exception. I swore under my breath. There were only 2 options here, and entering the store disguised as a customer was not one of them. I could either give up and leave, or... I steeled my nerves and reached out gently to push open the door a crack. 5 degrees. 10. There was no sound from within. Once I got it up to 15 degrees, the man's voice from earlier flowed into my ears. "Ha! Might as well chug it, Nezu. None of the beer in this place actually gets you drunk anyway." In a contrast, his statement seemed to be plenty drunk already. It was true that you could drink gallons of beer in Einkrad and never take a single molecule of alcohol, but it was fairly common for players to get drunk on the atmosphere of the situation. The excited cheers and yelling that floated through the doorway were no different from what could be heard from groups of college students walking through the nightlife district after a few rounds of drinks in the real world. I strained my ears and heard the hesitant "okay" in a quiet voice. The chattering died down for a moment, only to be followed by an excited cheer and applause. Based on the evidence, I assumed that 5 or so people waiting for Neza at the bar were close friends of his. This came at a surprise to me, as my experience crafters tended to be lone wolves, or in Neza's case, sheep. I was curious as to the player builds of his friends, but there was no way to identify their playstyles based on their voices alone. I decided to take another risk and peer over the top of the swinging doors, just for an instant. I blinked quickly, like a shutter of a camera, and then pulled my head back. As I suspected, there were only one group in the cramped interior, and if I tried to waltz in pretending to be a customer, I would have drawn all their notice. There were 6 of them, sitting at the table at the far right corner. Neza had his back to the door, and the other 5 were all appeared to be fighters, clad in leather armor and metal armor. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary. It was completely normal for MMORPG guilds to have fighters and crafters mingling naturally. The official guild feature of SAO wasn't unlocked until a particular quest on the 3rd floor was beaten, but many players had gathered into organized groups already. In fact, solo players like Asuna and me were already in the minority. Having a crafter or merchant in the group made equipment maintenance and selling loot much easier for adventurers, and crafters could get the materials they needed for cheap, if not for free altogether. So there was nothing wrong with Neza having friends who happened to be fighters, but the lump of suspicion in my chest did not show any signs of disappearing. Just as I was trying to figure out the exact nature of what troubled me, one of the friends who just entertained by Neza downing an entire mug of beer said something that caught my ear. So, Nezu, how was business today? Oh, I sold 12 new weapons, and I got a few visitors for repairs and upgrades. Hey, that's a new record. We'll have to scrape together some more ingots. 2 other men shouted, and there was another round of applause. It was the very picture of a close-knit band of friends with a network of support. I didn't recognize any of the other 5, which meant they probably weren't frontline players. But they didn't rise to that rank soon, with a talent of blacksmith on their side. Maybe I really am being paranoid. I felt ashamed. If Neza really was using some kind of bug or trick to intentionally downgrade or destroy other players' weapons, it would have to be planned and supported by his entire group. And I just couldn't see the logical motive for them doing that. With considerable pain, I recalled that Diavel the Knight, leader of the 1st floor boss raid party, had gone through the secondary negotiator in an attempt to buy my Neoblade +6. Only in his final moment of my life did I learn that he'd done it to deny me my last attack bonus on the boss. In hindsight, I did score that very last hit on the Kobold Lord, and earned his unique Code of Midnight for the feat. So there was a kind of logic behind Diavel's attempt to lower my attack output. But on the other hand, Neza and his friends were not even on the front line. They weren't in any point to be concerned with the boss's LA bonus. There was no benefit to ruining Rufiel and Asuna's weapons. I guess it really was just a series of coincidences. I sighed silently to myself, and was prepared to let go of the swinging door and close it when something stopped my hand. I don't think we can keep doing it, came the sound of Neza's frail voice. The men carousing inside the bar suddenly went quiet. After a short silence, the first man responded, but in a whisper too quiet for me to make out. I pushed the door again, moving the angle 20 degrees. It's fine. You're doing great. That's right, Nezu. Nobody's talking about it in the least. I held my breath. I had a feeling they were talking about the failed upgrade attempts, and focused all my attention on the words. Neza protested against their apparent encouragement. It's too dangerous to keep up. Besides, we've already made back our costs. Are you kidding? We're just getting started. We got to rake it in so we can catch up onto the top players while we're still on the 2nd floor. Made back the cost? Rake it in? I leaned forward, unsure of what they were discussing. Was it really unrelated to the upgrade failures? After all, Nezo should have lost money buying back Rufiel's spent sword, and he only made the standard fee in Asuna's case, nothing more. How could that make him any money? No, No, there was a way. Perhaps I was looking at this from the wrong viewpoint. Just then, a suspicious voice arose from the bar. Huh? Hey, look at the door. I closed the door as smoothly as I could and immediately jumped off to the right, flattening myself against a nearby tree and employing my hiding skill. Almost immediately, the swinging door burst outward. The face that emerged was of the leader-like man who'd been sitting next to Neza and egging him on. He wore blanded armor that made his already hefty form look even more rotund, and a bassinet helm with a pointed top. While the overall effect was humorous, the sharp look in his eyes was anything but. His thick eyebrows squinted, scanning the surroundings of a bar. The moment his eyes passed over the spot I was hiding, the indicator dropped to 60%. I wasn't in any physical danger within the safe zone of the town, but I didn't want to alarm them. I was just starting to peel back the curtain on Neza and his 5 friends' plot. The tools at my disposal were poor, but all I needed were answers. My hide rate dropped and continuously while his eyes was fixed on the tree. If I got down below 40%, he would certainly detect something was wrong with the tree's outline. I kept an eye on the number and slowly tried to rotate around the back of the trunk. Inch by inch I crawled, trying to keep the fluctuating value from creeping below 50. Once I was around the backside of the tree, he must have looked away, because the hide rate jumped back to 70%. A few seconds later, I heard the creaking of the door swing shut and dashed through the alley until I was a block away from the pub. Whew! I leaned against the wall and wiped away a cold virtual sweat with the sleeve of my coat. If this was what Argo the Rat did every day in her profession, then I was in no mood to follow that line of work. I might have made a poor spy, but at least I'd try to succeed at my mission. I found Neza at the base's operation, probably the second floor of the bar, discovered the existence of his partners, and even gained a little fragment of information about the mystery trick behind the failed weapon upgrades. That was assuming that the snippets of conversation I overheard were in fact related to such a trick. If it was true, they were somehow profiting from forcing other players' upgrade attempts to fail, profiting enough that they would even staying in the black by buying a spent +0 weapon at twice its going rate. If that was possible, was someone else paying them money for intentionally sabotage the orders of specific players? That was hard to imagine. It was such a roundabout way to get back at someone, and there was no guarantee that the target would ever come to Nazi for his services. If this mystery client was going to spend money, they'd be much better served following Diavel's plan and contacting the target directly. But if that wasn't the case, what was the other explanation that could be? The thoughts raced through my head so fast I could practically feel the steam shooting from my ears. The scene from less than an hour ago replayed in my head. Neza taking the wind fleuret from Asuna, accepting the materials and putting them into the forge with his right hand, sword in the left. When the forge was full of blue light, he pulled the sword from the scabbard and laid the blade into the fire. Once infused with that blade with light, he moved it to the anvil and struck it with his hammer. A few seconds after that, the sword shone like a death scream, and then shattered and disappeared. I watched the entire string of events. I couldn't believe that there had been some sleight of hand there. If I had to assume that deception had occurred, perhaps it was in the materials. But there was no way to mimic the bright blue light that flashed out of the forge. Wait. I thought I had seen the entire thing. But there was one moment. One spot, invisible to both me and Asuna. That meant that the materials that he'd falsified... Gah! My mind jumped over several logical steps and landed at a conclusion. I grunted and slapped my main menu open, checking the time readout in the corner. The digital clock said 8:23. There's still time. My hand flashed to the instant message tab, but I reconsidered and brought it down, closing the window. It was impossible to describe what I was to do in text. I had to state it directly in person. "There's still enough time to pull this off," I said aloud, this time bursting out of the alleyway and racing north down the street. The route that took 8 minutes to cross during my attempt at spy work was less than 3 in a blazing sprint. I reached the familiar eastern plaza of Urbis, but shot straight through it, to the north without stopping, and back into the streets of the town. Past the bench where Asuna had cried, then hard turned shortly after. I burst through the door of her inn and raced upstairs, taking 3 steps at a time. Thanking my lucky stars that I had asked for her room number, I charged over to room 207 and slammed on the door as if to break it down. It followed the same physical rules as any other closed door, but several long seconds after knocking, it would allow voices to pass through. "Asuna, it's me! I'm coming in!" I turned the knob without waiting for an answer and practically pushed the door down. Instantly, my eyes met those figures who leapt from behind the bed like a shot. Her hazel eyes were wide, and she was sucking air through her lips when I slammed the door shut. Ah! The scream was completely smothered by the closed door. I felt almost like a criminal. What I did was practically a crime, but this was all for Asuna's sake. She clenched her fists over her chest and continued to scream. She was wearing a white sleeveless shirt on top and some kind of poofy rounded shorts below. This didn't seem to be underwear, so I gauged that it was safe to walk over and grab her shoulders. "Asuna, this is an ultra emergency. There is no time. Just do as I say." She finally stopped screaming, but I could see on her face that she was simply deciding whether to resume screaming even louder or to start attacking me directly. But there was truly no time for anything else. I had to get to the point immediately. "First, call up your window and set it to visible mode. Now!" What? Just do it! I grabbed her hand and clutched her in front of her chest and moved it to the appropriate motion, pushing out 2 of her fingers and sliding them through the air. A purple window materialized with a smooth sound effect, but it only looked like a blank, flat board to me. I guided her fingers over the general location of the button that would display the contents of the window to other players. "But, I thought I locked the door," she murmured. I answered without thinking. "You're still partnered up with me, remember? The default setting in the room doors allowed guild and party members in." What? You didn't tell me that." I swiveled around next to the fencer, peering at the now visible contents of her main menu. It was arranged just like mine, but with a floral pattern skin selected. For a moment, I was surprised, remembering that my own window was still in the default setting, and then scolded myself for getting distracted. The right side of the window featured a familiar equipment mannequin. It was mostly empty, as she was not wearing any armor. I scrolled past the something or other, camisole, and whoop-de-doo petticoat to look at the right hand cell. No item selected, meaning that Asuna had not equipped a new weapon since giving her wind fleuret to Neza. Okay, first condition complete. Now time. The clock in the bottom right corner read 20:28, despite how fast I'd run. Asuna had returned to Urbis after a wind wasp hunt at 1900. We finally had finished eating dinner around 1930. Immediately afterward, we had moved to the plaza and asked Neza to upgrade her weapon, meaning that there was only a minute or 2 to spare. Crap, we gotta make this quick. Just hit the buttons as I tell you. Move to the storage tab. Okay. Asuna faithfully followed my order, perhaps so confused by the sudden turn of events that she had no time to resist. Next to the settings button, search button. Now there should be one that says manipulate storage. Her slender finger flashed over the buttons, diving deeper and deeper into the menu. After 3 or 4 selections, we finally reached the button I wanted. There! That's it! Materialize all items! Hit it! I screamed. She hit the tiny button, bringing up a yes or no prompt at maximum volume. Yes! Click! Asuna muttered to herself as she hit the button. Materialize all items? When it says all items, does it mean... With the satisfied smile of a man who did his job, I replied, all, everything, the entire shebang. the whole 9 yards. The next moment, all of the rows of text of Asuna's inventory vanished, and then clunk, clank, thud, wham, hood, clink, flip, flip, whack, swish, foof, came a cavalcade of sound from hard and heavy to light and airy. Every single item contained in Asuna's player inventory had been materialized into the game world to fall onto the floor in a great messy pile. What? What? The mess's owner couldn't contain her shock at what had just happened. But I knew it was coming. This was what I'd run into all the way from the other side of Urbis to do. My hitch was my slight underestimation of the volume of her inventory, just a mere 2 or 3 times what I'd expected. The amount of space for storage varied depending on the player's strength, expansion kill, and the presence of certain magical items. For a moment, I marveled at how Asuna, a low-level player with no expansion skill and an agility-heavy fencer build, could have packed so many items in. The answers soon became apparent. Capacity was determined not by volume, but weight. Metal armor and weapons, liquids such as potions, and stacks of coins all put a major dent on item storage. On the other hand, lighter items such as leather armor and accessories, rolls of bread, and parchment scrolls could be packed in there with ease. The majority of Asuna's inventory was taken up with those loose effects, big and small, meaning clothes and undergarments. I started at the 4-foot-tall pile of stuff, feeling slightly self-conscious. The heavier items had fallen out first, so the metal equipment was at the bottom, followed by leather goods, and then various clothes, and finally, resting on top, a small mound of frilly white and pink underwear. What was the point of keeping so many of them? Avatars in Aincrad had no bodily waste functions, and the only thing that took durability damage in battle was the outer armor. You would only truly need 1 set of underwear. I had 3, for battle, everyday use, and sleeping, but that was probably on the high side for a male player. And yet, I couldn't stop here. If my suspicion was correct, and we'd hit the command in time, it would be here, piled at the bottom of this mountain. "Pardon me," I said, ever the gentleman, and started shoving down piles of clothes out of the way. I hear a trembling voice over my shoulder. Excuse me, do you have a death wish? Are you one of those people who dream of dying in battle?" "No way," I said, in all honesty, still scrabbling through the pile. I got through the clothes to the leather armor, gloves, and small boxes, and finally reached the metal layer at the bottom. With great effort, I pushed them aside and got to the very last section of the little mountain, the heaviest item an Asuna owned. Though light as a feather compared to what I slung over my back, a single rapier, wind fleuret +4. I grabbed the green scabbard and lifted it out of the pile and turned around to face Asuna. Her eyes had the look of one deciding a suitable means of execution. But they grew wide, and then she saw the sword she'd thought was gone forever, her lips trembling, a tiny little squeak escaping her throat. "No way,"